Right now, as you listen to this, an object the size of a mountain is silently cutting through the void, drawing closer to a world that for decades we have told ourselves was dead. Astronomers call it 3I Atlas, the third interstellar visitor to enter our solar system in recorded history. On the surface, that might sound like another exotic comet, another icy wanderer from deep space that happens to pass through our neighbourhood and vanish again into the black. But what makes Atlas impossible to dismiss is how its behaviour contradicts the rules that govern every other frozen body we have ever observed. It is moving in ways that no natural comet should move. It is releasing gases in places where no natural comet should release them. And it is headed not on a random swing through the solar system, but on a path that will bring it terrifyingly close to Mars, a planet that for decades has been the dream of colonizers, scientists, visionaries, and governments with hidden agendas. Stay with me on this late-night exploration as we start unravelling why the mere fact of Atlas's trajectory is enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone paying attention. You think of interstellar objects as drifting through gravitational lanes, falling under the influence of suns and planets, bending their orbits, but never steering them. Yet Atlas does something different. Its path shows course corrections, subtle but undeniable shifts in velocity that suggest propulsion rather than freefall. The first time researchers mapped its approach, they assumed measurement error. The second time, they blamed observational artifacts. By the third correction, the pattern was too precise to dismiss. Natural comets tumble. They follow the ballistic arcs written into their fates by the gravity wells they encounter. But Atlas behaves like something navigating, and when navigation is involved, coincidence disappears. The object is on a long fall from the direction of Sagittarius, a region of the galaxy thick with ancient stars. That alone is strange, because most comets that wander near us originate from the Oort cloud, a sphere of icy debris surrounding our system. Atlas, by contrast, has been travelling for thousands of years across interstellar space, possibly millions. Yet its approach is timed with an elegance that borders on suspicious. It will not pass through randomly. It will not graze Neptune or Jupiter and slingshot away. Instead, its closest brush with our Sun will align almost perfectly with Mars's orbit. Think of that. Out of the infinite chaos of galactic trajectories, this object arrives at exactly the right moment and at exactly the right angle to interact with the red planet. That is like throwing a dart from another continent and hitting the bullseye of a board you cannot see. The odds are functionally zero if left to chance, which leaves only one explanation. It is not chance. Scientists who are willing to whisper about it behind closed doors have noted another anomaly. Atlas began venting gases, carbon dioxide most notably, while still 4.4 astronomical units from the Sun. At that distance, the cold should lock everything solid. No known physics allows for sublimation at that range unless the object carries volatile compounds so unstable they would have already vented long before arrival. Yet Atlas did not. Its release of gas began suddenly, as though triggered, and the ratio of carbon dioxide to water was 8:1. Random chemistry does not produce that balance, but deliberate atmospheric engineering does. On Earth, if you wanted to terraform a planet like Mars, the recipe would be precisely that mixture. Carbon dioxide to thicken an atmosphere and trap heat. Water vapour to seed clouds, to provide humidity, to feed reactions that would melt ice reserves at the poles and release more gas trapped in the regolith. This is not idle speculation. These are the same equations NASA has published in academic journals when modelling how we might one day try to make Mars habitable. Yet here, in front of our telescopes, an interstellar object carries exactly the cocktail required, delivering it on a trajectory so tuned to Mars that calling it coincidence borders on delusion. Ask yourself, what happens if all of that material is dumped into the Martian sky? Even conservative models predict rapid thickening of the air, temperatures rising by tens of degrees, Polar caps melting not over centuries of human effort but within years. A dead world shuddering awake, not with human technology but with something far older, far more prepared. And once you see those dots, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who prepared it and why? Already, agencies that publicly treat Atlas as another comet are scrambling behind the scenes. Leaked memos, hurried budget reallocations, and sudden surges of interest in Mars colonization projects all point to one truth. Governments know Atlas is not random. They may not understand its full purpose, but they understand enough to prepare. And when governments prepare in silence, when secrecy blankets something this enormous, it should make every civilian wonder what nightmare scenarios are being modelled out of sight. The silence of officials contrasts with the noise of history. Because ancient records, thousands of years old, speak of sky gods arriving from the direction of Sagittarius. They describe cycles, periods of return that span thousands of years, tied to alignments of planets and the reappearance of celestial messengers. Cuneiform tablets, fragile and weathered, detail events that sound eerily like what is happening now. A starborn object visiting, releasing gases, transforming a world before vanishing again. Scholars dismissed those writings as myth. But myth has a strange way of mutating into memory when evidence suddenly aligns. When a comet emerges from the very part of the sky those tablets mention, when it carries the very chemicals they describe, skepticism begins to collapse. None of this would matter if Atlas were a curiosity bound for empty space, but it is not. Its arc intersects Mars at the exact window when colonization fever grips our species. Elon Musk's visions, NASA's Artemis extensions, China's long-term settlement plans, all orbit around one idea: Mars as humanity's next frontier. Now imagine if, on the eve of our reaching it, a cosmic intruder arrives to transform it for someone else. Not for us, not for our timelines, but for purposes we cannot control. Suddenly, every dollar invested, every plan laid, every rocket built becomes irrelevant. We are playing catch-up in a game whose pieces were arranged millennia before our species learned to farm. And here is where paranoia sharpens into dread. If Atlas were the first such visitor, we might dismiss it as anomaly. But it is not. Oumuamua and Tuai Borisov came before, each with peculiarities scientists struggle to explain. They vented oddly. They reflected light in ways inconsistent with comets. They followed paths that hinted at observation more than accident. What if they were scouts? Small-scale tests delivering minor adjustments, seeding preliminary components. And now Atlas, larger and richer in chemicals, arrives to complete the process. Mars may not be targeted by chance, but by an ongoing program that stretches across centuries. Each object part of a sequence, each delivery timed, each adjustment preparing the planet for its final transformation. Once you see the pattern, it is hard to unsee. Atlas is not simply passing by, it is arriving on schedule. The date of closest approach, October 29th, 2025, coincides not only with orbital efficiency, but with cycles noted in Mesopotamian calendars, cycles said to bring the return of the Anunnaki, beings described as engineers of worlds. You do not need to believe the mythology to feel the weight of coincidence piling up. The timing is too perfect, the chemistry too exact, the trajectory too deliberate. What we are watching may be less a natural phenomenon than a phase in a project larger than human history. So what will really happen to Mars when Atlas passes by? If models are correct, we may witness the rebirth of a planet. The atmosphere thickens. Dust storms gain power, but also stability. Liquid water begins to persist on the surface, not in fleeting trickles, but in rivers and lakes. The polar ice caps retreat. Gases long frozen in soil pockets release, amplifying the process. Within years, conditions that humans thought would take centuries of effort begin unfolding with terrifying speed. And when Mars becomes warm enough, when pressure climbs high enough, biology may not be far behind. whether seeded deliberately from Atlas itself or awakened from dormant microbial reservoirs, life could reappear. Imagine the shock of seeing not a sterile desert but a world greening, clouding, even breathing. And imagine the deeper shock of realizing it was never our doing. This is not an event you watch as passive astronomy. This is an event that reorders human priorities overnight. Colonization timelines collapse or accelerate depending on how leaders interpret the threat. Some will argue we must rush to Mars to claim it before it is claimed by whoever sent Atlas. Others will argue the opposite, that we must stay away, that Mars is no longer a frontier but occupied territory. Either way, the one thing nobody will argue is indifference. The approach of Atlas demands a choice, not in decades but in months. And while humanity debates, Atlas continues its silent fall, carrying its engineered payload toward a planet that may not belong to us at all. When astronomers first plotted the path of 3I Atlas, they expected the usual. Objects from interstellar space travel in straight, uncompromising lines. Gravity bends them, but nothing alters their basic course. The mathematics of celestial mechanics is ruthless, indifferent to intention or coincidence. A comet without propulsion cannot choose where it goes. It is like a stone thrown across a frozen pond, sliding until friction or collision stops it. Yet Atlas defies this metaphor. It has behaved as though the pond itself curved beneath it, reshaping its slide until the numbers on the screens no longer matched the expectations written in textbooks. The first discrepancy was small enough to overlook, a faint deviation from projection, dismissed as observational error. Telescopes pick up noise, atmospheric distortions, mechanical limitations. Nobody sounded alarms. But then the second deviation appeared, not large, not obvious, but precise. Its vector shifted in ways that could not be blamed on gravitational pulls alone. Solar radiation pressure might account for micrometer changes. Outgassing might explain minor nudges if the comet was venting unevenly. But the data didn't fit those excuses. Instead, the object seemed to adjust as though correcting itself, almost like a spacecraft trimming its thrusters to stay aligned with a predetermined path. Natural comets do not correct themselves. They tumble, they spin, they outgas in chaotic bursts that push them off course, but never towards something specific. The statistics of probability make it clear. Random venting sends you astray. It doesn't send you neatly toward Mars. That is where the unease began. Because the further Atlas travelled, the more its deviations resembled deliberate navigation. The more its course looked less like the byproduct of random physics, and more like the execution of a plan. Analysts fed the numbers into simulation software. They tested every variable: gravity from nearby planets, solar wind, pressure from the faintest photons bouncing off its surface. None of them produced the trajectory Atlas was following. The only way to recreate it was to introduce tiny bursts of acceleration, like invisible engines firing. Each correction too clean to be mistaken for chaos, too consistent to be brushed aside as luck. Suddenly, the community faced a question it didn't want to ask out loud. What if Atlas was not drifting? What if it was driving? Imagine that for a moment. An object hundreds of meters across, ancient and silent, adjusting itself across interstellar distances with the kind of precision our best probes barely manage. Even our most advanced spacecraft, built with state-of-the-art propulsion systems and guided by teams of engineers, struggle with long-term accuracy. The idea that something not only makes those corrections, but makes them while travelling from another star system is unsettling at best, catastrophic at worst. Because it means we are not watching a comet. We are watching technology. Skeptics still argue for natural explanations. They point to outgassing patterns, the way frozen gases erupt into space when sunlight warms a comet's surface. But the problem is timing. Atlas began venting too far out, long before sunlight could explain it. And more importantly, those bursts occurred in ways that adjusted its course neatly, almost like thrusters aligned at perfect angles. Chaos disguised as order is possible, but order disguised as chaos, that is deliberate. This is where the conversation turns darker, because if Atlas is adjusting, then it has a destination. And if its destination happens to be Mars, the implications reach far beyond curiosity. An engineered comet means engineering intent. Someone or something designed this path. Someone calculated arrival windows, gravitational assists, and fuel expenditures not in months or years but in millennia. To design a trajectory like this is to think on timescales that dwarf our civilizations. To execute it is to wield technology beyond anything we can build today. Tracing its path backward through space reveals an unsettling origin. The data suggests Atlas comes not from the Oort cloud, not from a nearby star system, but from the thick disk of our galaxy, a region filled with old stars, remnants of a formation era billions of years past. That means Atlas has been moving for an almost incomprehensible time, yet still manages to arrive now, precisely aligned with Mars's orbit, precisely timed with cycles noted in ancient records. This is not random. This is not luck. This is deliberate placement. Think about what that means. Before Earth had continents, before mammals existed, something may have launched Atlas. Across eons, through voids so empty light itself takes years to cross. It travelled with patient accuracy until it entered our neighbourhood. That kind of foresight suggests a program, a sequence, a project that has been unfolding since before humanity existed. It is not here for us specifically. It is here because Mars is ready, because the cycle demands it, because the timetable of whoever sent it dictates this moment. We just happen to be watching now, perhaps earlier than intended. Once you accept that possibility, a chilling set of scenarios emerges. The most benign is that Atlas is a terraforming seed, a delivery vehicle meant to alter Mars for future use. In this view, its trajectory exists to ensure a precise flyby at the right orbital distance for material release, a controlled dispersal of gases and dust injected at velocities perfect for capture by Mars's weak atmosphere. Too close, and it crashes. Too far, and the gases disperse uselessly. Just right, and it begins a transformation, and Atlas's navigation shows every sign of seeking just right. But the darker scenario is harder to shake. If Atlas navigates, it observes. If it observes, it may also assess. Mars might be the target, but Earth is watching. Our instruments, our telescopes, our rovers, all feeding back data to us, and perhaps to it. The very act of monitoring may be part of the design, forcing us to see, forcing us to confront what we cannot control. Its trajectory might not only exist to reach Mars, it may exist to reach our awareness, to test how we respond when something impossible unfolds in front of us. Already the impact on human society is brewing beneath the surface. Stock markets connected to space industries jitter. Classified budgets swell without explanation. Private corporations with interests in Mars settlements receive sudden surges of funding and new restrictions. Behind every polite press release calling Atlas an interesting interstellar comet lies a calculation about what happens if it proves otherwise. Because the moment humanity admits its trajectory is deliberate, the illusion of control evaporates. We become observers in someone else's program. There is another detail worth noting, one that keeps resurfacing among those willing to run the numbers without fear of ridicule. Atlas's approach is not only aligned with Mars, its speed relative to the Sun is slower than expected for an interstellar object. Oumuamua moved so fast it could never be captured, destined to sail on forever. Borisov too. But Atlas's velocity is suspiciously tuned, almost as if it intended not to escape but to linger. Objects from deep space should not slow down like this, unless of course they are built to. The unsettling truth is that humanity has no capacity to stop or even intercept something like this. Our fastest rockets would take years to catch it, and by then It will have already passed Mars and completed whatever mission it carries. We can only watch, only measure, only guess. And perhaps that is part of the design too, forcing a technologically adolescent species into the role of spectator, powerless to alter the trajectory not just of the comet but of its own future. Some scientists whisper about the possibility that Atlas is not the first to follow such a path. Orbital analyses suggest previous interstellar visitors might have brushed by in the past, unnoticed because we lack the instruments to track them. Each one perhaps part of a sequence, each one delivering a fragment of material, a coded step in an operation too vast for us to perceive until the final stages. And now, at the moment when our eyes are sharp enough to notice, the most critical piece arrives. If true, then Atlas's trajectory is not just unusual. It is the culmination of a long series of trajectories we were never meant to see, until now. The real question then becomes, what happens after it passes Mars? Does it slingshot away, mission complete? Does it alter course again, heading toward another target? Or does it linger in the inner system, waiting? None of those outcomes fit within the framework of natural comets. All of them suggest a program still in motion. And all of them suggest that the story of Atlas does not end with its closest approach, but only begins there. Every telescope that can track it will track it. Every observatory will watch. But watching may not change the truth that has already been written into its path. Atlas moves as though on rails, its invisible hand steady, its corrections precise. A trajectory that should not exist is unfolding in front of us, undeniable and unstoppable. And with every passing day, with every adjustment it makes, Mars looms closer as the focal point of something we cannot explain, something that might redefine what it means to live in a solar system that was never truly ours to begin with. When researchers first measured the gases venting from 3I Atlas, they expected the usual. Comets, no matter how exotic their origins, tend to follow a familiar chemical script. Frozen water ice, carbon monoxide, dust, sometimes small traces of organics that hint at the raw materials of life. That is the pattern written into every cometary nucleus studied since the dawn of spectroscopy. So when the first data came back confirming carbon dioxide, nobody panicked. Carbon dioxide is common enough in frozen bodies. It can be trapped within ice, released as sunlight penetrates the surface, driven into space in white plumes that briefly alter a comet's shine. Nothing about that in isolation raised alarms. What raised alarms was the ratio, 8-1, carbon dioxide to water, not 2-1, not 3-1, 8-1. It was so precise, so consistent across observations, that even skeptics had to admit it looked engineered rather than accidental. Nature is messy. Cosmic chemistry produces variety, not perfection. Outgassing tends to fluctuate as the comet rotates, exposing different surfaces, releasing different layers. But Atlas vented with stability, a composition that didn't wander or weaken, but held steady at exactly the ratio one would calculate if tasked with thickening the air of a thin, cold planet like Mars. That fact might sound trivial until you remember the nature of Mars itself. Its atmosphere is almost entirely carbon dioxide already, but so thin it cannot hold heat. Its pressure is less than 1% of Earth's. Anyone standing on its surface without a suit would asphyxiate in seconds, and the boiling point of water is so low there that liquid cannot persist. To change that, you would not want to add nitrogen or oxygen first. You would want more carbon dioxide, much more, until the air grows thick enough to trap heat and create a greenhouse effect strong enough to unlock frozen reserves buried in the soil. Once that begins, the process snowballs. Melting polar ice releases still more carbon dioxide, amplifying warming until the planet crosses a threshold. After that, clouds form. Humidity rises, temperature stabilizes, and slowly the sterile desert shifts into a world where liquid water flows freely again. NASA has run these numbers, so has the European Space Agency. Terraforming proposals drafted in white papers tucked into journals and filed into speculative research programs, all converge on the same point. If you had to kickstart Mars into something habitable, you would start with carbon dioxide, and not just in any proportion. The sweet spot lies close to the very ratio Atlas carries, an eerie mirror, as though the comet's core had been designed with Mars in mind rather than the randomness of interstellar chemistry. Skeptics try to dismiss it as coincidence. They argue that carbon dioxide is a simple molecule, abundant across the universe, that comets vary, and sometimes their compositions skew one way or another. Yet even they cannot ignore how Atlas began releasing this mix far beyond the point physics allows. 4.5 astronomical units from the Sun, an object should remain frozen solid. Temperatures hover so low that carbon dioxide should be locked beneath layers of ice, stable for eons. But Atlas broke that expectation. It started venting early, as if triggered, as if some mechanism inside had activated according to a clock. The release wasn't chaotic either. It was measured, deliberate, continuous, as though carefully rationed for the journey ahead. Ask yourself, if Atlas was natural, why would it behave like this? Why would its venting not only defy physics, but align perfectly with terraforming blueprints drafted by human scientists who only in the last few decades began imagining how to warm Mars? Either humanity somehow predicted a cosmic coincidence of staggering improbability, or we are staring at technology operating in plain sight. The unsettling part is how subtle it looks. To the naked eye, Atlas still resembles a comet. A bright core, a dusty tail, the familiar signature of frozen gases boiling away in sunlight. If you didn't measure, you wouldn't know. If you didn't look too closely, you'd dismiss it as just another icy rock. But the precision in its chemistry betrays intent disguised as randomness, technology wearing the mask of geology. That is perhaps the most terrifying trick, to blend so seamlessly with natural processes that only the careful, the suspicious, the insomniac staring at data late at night notice something is wrong. And once you notice, you begin to see the implications everywhere. If Atlas releases this cocktail into Mars's sky, the planet's equilibrium changes overnight. Atmospheric pressure creeps upward. Temperatures rise by several degrees in a matter of months. Polar ice, no longer in perfect balance, begins to retreat. Gas long trapped in soil pores bubbles out, amplifying the effect. The entire system cascades towards stability. Not chaos, but stability. A new stability engineered toward habitability. This is not random venting. This is delivery. This is deployment. This is action taken with purpose. Consider what it means for Mars's future. For decades, human colonization plans have been chained to the slow crawl of technology. Build habitats, import resources, generate greenhouse gases artificially with machines, hope for centuries of incremental change. Now, imagine watching a shortcut unfold without you. A cosmic courier delivering exactly what you need in exactly the proportions required, timed not to your schedule, but to one set long before your existence. Every dream of becoming the terraformers of Mars collapses in that moment. We were never the terraformers, we were always the spectators. And the worst part is this. Maybe it has happened before. Planetary surveys of Mars reveal strange deposits, chemical anomalies in the soil near the poles, concentrations of material that match what you would expect from past deliveries of carbon dioxide-rich comets. Some appear relatively recent, within the last few centuries, as if Atlas has predecessors. If so, then Mars has been receiving doses of its atmospheric medicine for a long time, each one a step in a patient, deliberate sequence. What we are seeing now may be only the final phase, the last injection required to tip the balance. This interpretation reframes everything about our solar system. If Atlas carries purpose, then so might the objects that came before, Oumuamua, Borisov. Were they part of the same program, scouts testing conditions, smaller payloads seeding initial changes? If so, then the carbon dioxide puzzle is not a puzzle at all, but a plan, and Mars has been the target all along. Of course, this idea terrifies governments, admitting it would collapse entire industries, billions spent on rockets, life support systems, radiation shielding, all rendered obsolete if Mars can be made habitable without human effort. Entire economic empires built around the promise of human-led colonization would become worthless. No politician wants to explain why $1 trillion investment just evaporated because the cosmos got there first. And so the silence continues, the downplaying, the reassurances that Atlas is just a comet, just a curiosity, nothing to see here. Meanwhile, calculations behind closed doors sketch scenarios of a Mars transformed by forces nobody on Earth controls. But silence does not erase the facts. The ratios are real. The early venting is real. The chemistry is real. And the trajectory that places this delivery within reach of Mars's thin sky, is undeniable. All the denial in the world cannot rewrite those numbers. The most disturbing possibility lingers unspoken in scientific circles, that Atlas is not only delivering a chemical payload, but also carrying biological seeds, microorganisms encased in ice, waiting for the right environment to wake. The ratio of carbon dioxide to water could serve as the trigger. Warm the planet, raise the humidity, and the seeds activate. Life, not ours, begins to take hold. That would explain why the ratio is so exact, not just to change the climate, but to prepare it for something specific, something chosen, something seeded. If that is true, then Mars is not about to become humanity's new world. It is about to become someone else's. And here is the bitter irony. For years, humans have dreamed of sending engineered comets to Mars themselves as terraforming tools. Academic papers describe diverting icy bodies, crashing them deliberately, seeding the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and water vapour. Yet when the first such act unfolds before our eyes, it isn't ours. It belongs to something we don't understand, something older, something already at work. We dreamed of being the gods of Mars. Instead, we may only be the witnesses. Every telescope pointed at Atlas continues to gather data. Every spectrum confirms the same unsettling reality. This is not random. The puzzle is no longer whether carbon dioxide exists in Atlas. The puzzle is why it exists in such precise measure, why it vents so early, and why its delivery aligns so neatly with the requirements for transforming Mars. The pieces fit too cleanly, the picture too obvious for coincidence. Yet acknowledging that truth means admitting humanity is not the prime mover of its own destiny in the solar system, and that is a truth few are prepared to face. At a distance where sunlight is little more than a faint glow, comets should remain dormant. That is the rule. At 4 or 5 astronomical units from the Sun, temperatures are too low for most volatile compounds to break free. Water remains locked in crystalline cages. Carbon dioxide should stay frozen solid. Even carbon monoxide, one of the more volatile ices, usually requires a nudge closer before it begins to stir. Out there, in the frozen dark, comets drift like time capsules, unchanged for billions of years, waiting for the heat of the inner system to peel away their shells. That is why astronomers monitor them, because their silence makes them predictable. They stay quiet until they cross thresholds that physics has already mapped. But 3i Atlas refuses to stay quiet. The first signals of its awakening came long before anyone expected. Plumes venting into the void, shimmering tails forming at distances where nothing should sublimate. Researchers ran through every explanation they could muster. Maybe Atlas carried exotic ices more volatile than usual. Maybe it had been heated by an unusual encounter with a star before entering our system. Maybe impacts had fractured its crust, exposing reservoirs close to the surface. Yet none of these hypotheses fit the data. Atlas began venting too suddenly, too cleanly, and with too consistent a chemical profile. It looked less like natural thawing and more like a switch had been thrown. That is the first unsettling clue. Activation. Not slow warming, not chaotic venting, but something that looks for all the world like an internal mechanism clicking on at a predetermined distance. It is as if Atlas carried instructions: wake at 4.4 AU, begin release, maintain ratio, continue until target is reached. Instructions imply design. Design implies purpose. Purpose implies someone somewhere set this in motion. The timing makes the picture even stranger, because Atlas did not awaken in gradual fits. It did not pulse unpredictably like ordinary comets do when one side rotates into sunlight. Instead, its activity increased steadily, as though calibrated. Too little to draw global headlines, too much for experts to ignore. Almost like it wanted to be noticed only by those watching closely, the kind of people who would measure ratios and compare them to terraforming equations. Which raises the unsettling question: was this activation not just about Mars, but about us? Were we meant to see it, meant to realize it, meant to understand that something beyond our control was underway? This possibility unsettles even seasoned researchers, because it hints at communication without words, not a signal beamed in radio frequencies, not a flashing light in the sky, but chemistry itself used as a message. If you wanted to announce intent without language, you might choose to reveal an impossible ratio at an impossible distance, in a way that forces the observer to admit it cannot be natural. A message written in gas, readable only by those who know what that ratio means for a planet like Mars. That is what Atlas's activation looks like. A demonstration. And consider the implications of how it activates. For a natural comet, outgassing is messy. It tumbles, it vents unevenly, it alters trajectory in chaotic spurts. But Atlas shows smoothness, corrections that align with its path rather than distort it. Instead of random tumbling, it steers itself closer to its goal. This is not the behaviour of an inert rock. This is the behaviour of something alive in the mechanical sense, something governed by systems rather than chance. A machine disguised as a mountain of ice. That image, unsettling as it is, fits disturbingly well with ancient accounts of skyborne objects described as living stars, as gods in motion. They were not described as ships in the way we imagine spacecraft, sleek and metallic. They were described as moving mountains, glowing and venting, alive but not alive, carrying purpose hidden beneath appearances. Thousands of years ago, such descriptions would have sounded like myth. Now they sound suspiciously like field notes from early observers who watched something like Atlas activate in the skies. Skeptics argue that perhaps Atlas's activation is simply coincidence, a particularly volatile mixture of compounds. But the problem with that dismissal is how perfectly the activation aligns with Mars's position in the coming years. If it were coincidence, we would expect randomness, a burst too early to matter, a dispersal too weak to change anything. But Atlas wakes precisely at the distance required to ensure its gases remain stable until delivery. Wake earlier, and the cargo disperses. Wake later, and the planet misses the benefit. Wake now, and everything lines up. Coincidence shrinks under the weight of such precision. Activation also forces us to confront how little control humanity actually has. Our spacecraft, our rovers, our landers, all are feats of engineering measured in billions of dollars and years of planning. And yet none of them could achieve what Atlas seems to do effortlessly. We cannot trigger a spacecraft to awaken after millions of years in deep freeze and still function on cue. We cannot design something to maintain chemistry across interstellar travel without degradation, and yet here Atlas is, defying those limits with casual precision. That is what makes the activation in the cold void so disturbing. It does not only reveal purpose, it reveals superiority. Imagine a technology capable of building an object that drifts through the galaxy for millions of years, dormant yet intact, until a trigger distance flips its systems alive. That is not technology we can match. That is not even technology we can fully imagine. Our probes fail after decades. Our electronics degrade. Our systems need constant correction and maintenance. Atlas does not. It slumbers for ages, then wakes on command. If that is true, then we are not dealing with equals. We are watching the work of beings who treat interstellar distances as casually as we treat river crossings. And yet, part of the dread lies in how quiet it all is. No lights, no signals, no grand display. Just a steady exhalation of gases, a gradual tail stretching across the void, something that looks ordinary unless you know the numbers. Power hidden in plain sight, masked as natural phenomenon. That subtlety is its own kind of terror. It means that whoever set this in motion did not want attention. They wanted efficiency. They wanted inevitability. A system that could unfold without interference, unnoticed by civilizations too primitive to detect it. And only now, when humanity has reached a technological adolescence capable of measuring, do we begin to glimpse it. Not because we are ready to respond, but because the process has reached the stage where our awareness no longer matters. The phrase that keeps returning in discussions is cold start. In human engineering, a cold start is the moment when a dormant system comes online after a period of inactivity. Atlas appears to be performing a cold start in space itself. No technician to flip a switch, no operator guiding commands, just an autonomous awakening written into its design. That makes it not just a delivery system, but a self-managing one, a machine that carries its own schedule, immune to the failure of external control, guided only by triggers that transcend civilizations. Think of what that implies for Mars. If Atlas can wake itself at the right time, then it can deliver itself at the right place. Mars is not simply the next planet in line. Mars is the programmed target. The activation in the cold void proves that. And once the cargo is delivered, the planet will change whether we approve or not. Terraforming becomes not a dream, not a project, but an inevitability unfolding on someone else's timetable. What unsettles even more is the possibility that this activation is only phase 1. Venting gases may be the surface effect, but what lies inside Atlas? If it carries mechanisms, if it carries payloads more complex than frozen molecules, then activation could mean systems spinning up that we cannot yet detect. Machinery designed to release not only chemistry, but biology. Engines designed to alter trajectories after the initial release. Even transmissions designed to begin broadcasting once it nears its destination. We only see the first layer, the surface gas, because that is all our instruments can confirm. What lies beneath remains hidden, waiting for its next trigger. And this leads to an uncomfortable thought. What if Earth is also part of the plan? Not as the target, but as the witness. Atlas's activation ensures our instruments catch it. Our telescopes confirm ratios. Our scientists whisper about terraforming. It ensures we know, but cannot act. That is the cruelest design of all, forcing us to watch, to understand, but leaving us powerless to intervene. Perhaps that is the true function of activation in the cold void, to transform not only Mars, but our own perception of our place in the cosmos. If you follow the trail of details long enough, the question stops being theoretical. It shifts from what-ifs into a near certainty. Mars is not merely in the path of Atlas by accident. Patterns stack on top of patterns until coincidence becomes a lazy explanation for things that demand agency. Look at the evidence without the comforting veil of denial, and a picture forms. It is a picture of purpose aimed at a specific world, timed with a precision that suggests planning rather than happenstance. The idea that Mars is a random waypoint collapses the moment you add the chemistry, the trajectory corrections, the activation distance, and a history of prior anomalous visitors into the same equation. What remains is an inference that cannot be ignored. Mars was chosen. Start with the geometry. Atlas's orbital plane is such that its perihelion, the closest point to the Sun it will reach, positions it within the orbital bracket of Mars. For a free-floating interstellar object, the odds of matching that plane and timing so neatly are astronomically small. The calculations that produce such a close alignment require inputs that do not come from mere chance. They come from a design sense that understands gravitation, predicts perturbations, and accounts for the subtle tug of planets whose combined mass shapes trajectories. Whoever set Atlas on its way, or whatever process guided it through the galaxy, anticipated where Mars would be centuries or millennia in the future and timed the approach accordingly. That is not luck. That is foresight across timescales that make human planning look impulsive and immediate. Now add chemistry to the geometry. The ratio of carbon dioxide to water in Atlas is exactly the kind of payload you would calculate if your endgame were to shift a thin, cold atmosphere into a thicker, warmer one. Its release profile, steady and proportional, maximizes the chance that molecules will be captured by Mars's gravity and contribute meaningfully to atmospheric pressure rather than dispersing through space. You may argue that carbon dioxide is common throughout the cosmos. You may claim compositions vary, but composition alone does not explain the particularity of release timing combined with the trajectory aimed squarely at the red planet. The more variables you stack, timing, chemistry, path, the more the case for intention hardens. Then consider context. For decades we have studied Mars as a relic, a world that once had running water, a thicker atmosphere, perhaps a climate amenable to life. Scientists framed its loss as the result of slow processes, a weakening magnetic field, atmospheric stripping by the solar wind, catastrophic impacts. Those are valid explanations for how Mars became the world we see, but they leave an open question that becomes harder to ignore when Atlas arrives. If Mars ever supported a biosphere, why would any intelligence not consider it a prime candidate for restoration? A once habitable world needs less effort to revive than an entirely barren one. The cost-benefit analysis for anyone attempting to seed life or establish habitable zones would naturally weight Mars highly. It has water locked in ice, it has minerals, it sits in a stable orbit, and it carries a geological memory of habitability. If you were a civilization planning planetary engineering projects, Mars would be near the top of your list. Now imagine such plans arriving in the form of a patient courier like Atlas. The target choice becomes obvious. But even if you accept that Mars would be attractive to a long-term engineering program, you still have to account for the way the approach is orchestrated. Natural interstellar objects do not seek out constellations or align themselves with cultural calendars. Yet Atlas's arrival window rings a bell in the annals of ancient record-keeping. Multiple traditions describe cyclical returns of sky beings. Interpretations vary, and mainstream historians caution against making direct one-to-one correlations between myth and modern astrophysics. Still, the coincidence of orbital timing with cycles embedded in ancient calendars pushes the question toward deliberate selection rather than randomness. If an intelligence was familiar with our star system thousands of years ago, it could work backward from those calendars to schedule interactions at moments that would repeat on human timescales. The ritualistic nature of those calendars might even act as a strategy for predictable oversight of their work. Look too at the archaeological traces. There are chemical anomalies near the polar regions of Mars, deposits that do not neatly fit models of pure geological deposition. Some of these deposits have spectral signatures that match materials expected from cometary deliveries, not uniform cosmic dust. Those deposits appear in patterns that raise eyebrows, clusters near topographic lows, concentrations that align with hypothesized atmospheric circulation models, and regions where the introduction of volatiles would most efficiently trigger greenhouse feedbacks. Taken alone, such anomalies can be rationalized away. Taken together with Atlas's arrival, they become part of a larger puzzle where pieces line up in a way that challenges the comfortable assumption of randomness. Then there is the behavioral history of interstellar visitors. Oumuamua and Borisov arrived before Atlas. They were anomalies in their own right, each displaying oddities that defied neat classification. Some researchers hypothesized natural explanations for their strange appearance and motion, while others privately held out for more unsettling interpretations. If you look at those events as isolated, you can chalk them up to outliers. But if you consider them as elements in a sequence, a reconnaissance phase, a test phase, and now a deployment phase, the narrative shifts from isolated accidents to an orchestrated program. Under that model, Atlas is not an isolated incident, but the next logical step in a long game. The idea of target selection gains plausibility because it fits with a pattern of escalating complexity in interstellar interactions. Power dynamics matter too. Mars sits in a strategic position. It is close enough to Earth to be militarily and economically relevant, but far enough to serve as a staging ground, a buffer, a place to anchor technology without immediate conflict. In terrestrial terms, controlling Mars would be like controlling a high plateau overlooking much of a contested region. The logistics of supply, research, and strategic deployment favour a base on Mars if your aims include long-term presence or staging for inner-system operations. If an external intelligence sought to secure a foothold in our system without confronting Earth directly, transforming Mars would be an elegant solution. Make Mars habitable, set up systems there, and you gain a platform from which to observe and, if required, influence Earth's development. The strategic advantage of an engineered Mars is not merely theoretical. It is obvious to any actor thinking at the scale implied by Atlas's design. Beyond strategy, symbolism plays a role. Whatever intelligence built or programmed Atlas likely understood what Mars represents to us. The Red Planet has been the subject of myths, speculation, and scientific inquiry for centuries. It is emotionally and culturally charged in ways that make it an ideal location for demonstration. If you wanted to communicate capability without direct contact, making over Mars would be the most undeniable spectacle. You would not need to land on Earth, broadcast your presence, or risk interception. Transform a planet instead, and the spectacle is both undeniable and irreversible in its impact on human psychology. Turning Mars into a garden would eclipse any prior display of power. Whether that was the intention or a side effect, the optics are inescapable. Mars is the perfect billboard for capability. Still, some argue for restraint. They point out that an engineered Mars does not necessarily mean hostile intent. In theory, a civilization might value ecological restoration. Perhaps they are caretakers aiming to resurrect dead worlds for reasons simple and noble: biodiversity, preservation, or even scientific curiosity. From that altruistic vantage, Mars is not a prize to conquer, but a patient to heal. If Atlas is an intervention conceived with benign intent, the fact that it targets Mars could be read as mercy rather than strategy. It is a possibility worth acknowledging because intention matters as much as outcome, but even benevolence raises ethical questions. Who decided Mars should be returned to habitability? Who gets to determine what kind of biosphere it should host? Those decisions, if made by outsiders, deprive human beings, should we ever inhabit Mars, of agency over the future of a neighbouring world. The act of restoration becomes paradoxically an act of appropriation. And then there is timing. If Atlas is intended to trigger change on Mars now, the window matters deeply. Human civilization has reached a point where we could, within decades, establish a permanent presence. The interplay between our growing capabilities and Atlas's arrival cannot be overstated. If Mars becomes hospitable under someone else's timetable, before human settlements are self-sustaining, humanity faces a reality in which access to that transformed world may be limited, regulated, or even denied by the intelligence controlling the transformation. Imagine arriving at a now-green Mars only to find it already claimed and managed by technological systems far beyond human oversight. The geopolitical implications would be catastrophic. Nations would scramble to secure positions, private companies would seek leverage, and ethical debates would erupt over rightful stewardship. A transformed Mars would not be merely a scientific milestone, it would be a pivot point for civilization. Complicating matters further is the question of biological risk. If Atlas contains not only gases but biological inoculants, microbes tailored to survive in Martian conditions, the planet's transformation might come with an introduction of life forms alien to Earth. Their behaviour, interactions, and unintended consequences are unpredictable. They might outcompete local Martian chemistries, catalyse unanticipated reactions, or create ecosystems incompatible with human colonization goals. Even if the biological payload were benign in intention, ecological systems are notoriously sensitive. Introducing organisms to a place they never evolved to occupy can produce cascades that spiral out of control. The ethics of such a move are staggering, and they intensify the suspicion that Mars is being treated not as an independent world, but as a field to be engineered at will. Then there is the matter of surveillance. If a civilization is capable of delivering Atlas with precision, they almost certainly have sensing capabilities that dwarf our own. They would have predicted how humanity would react, anticipated our scientific capacity, and designed contingencies accordingly. Whether their goal is partnership or control, the moment Atlas becomes visible to our instruments is the moment they can observe our responses in detail. Every scientific briefing, every leaked memo, every social media panic becomes data. Our behaviour tells them whether we will be cooperative, resistant, or too fragmented to organise effectively. In that sense, turning Mars into a project in plain sight is also a diagnostic test. Can humanity respond coherently to the presence of a superior technology? Our answer to that test will shape how our species is treated in subsequent interactions. Finally, reflect on the human dimension. Mars has always been an existential mirror. Our fantasies about its red valleys and dust storms say as much about our yearnings as they do about the planet itself. If Atlas turns Mars into a living world on someone else's schedule, our myths, our ambitions, and our future projects will be reframed. Some will grieve for the lost possibility of human primacy in space. Others will celebrate the end of scarcity and the dawn of accessible off-world living. Entire ideologies will be tested and reshaped. The existential shock will not be merely technological, it will be cultural. Our notion of agency will be reframed by the realization that significant cosmic engineering can occur independent of human action. So when you ask whether Mars is a target or a coincidence, the answer grows less ambiguous each time you examine the evidence. The convergence of path, timing, chemistry, historical resonance, and strategic logic sketches an image too consistent with design to be casually dismissed. That does not solve the ultimate mystery of who or what orchestrated the program, or whether their aims are benign or malign. It simply moves the debate from whether Mars is targeted to what the consequences of that targeting will be for human civilization. Whether Atlas has been sent to heal a planet or to prepare a staging ground, the future of Mars is no longer a question for science fiction. It is a real, messy, immediate problem, and the choices we make now about observation, disclosure, coordination, and caution will determine whether humanity enters the next era as collaborators, subjects, or bystanders. Keep that in mind as the countdown to closest approach continues. The sky will not provide easy answers, it will only deepen the mystery. Observing Mars as it responds to Atlas will be a slow, accumulating revelation, one data set after another folding into an increasingly impossible picture. And when the first undeniable sign of change appears on the red planet, it will not be a single moment of epiphany. It will be a cascade. Pressure readings, spectral shifts, weather anomalies, a subtle warming of polar regions. Science will document it clinically, but the social and political fallout will unfold with a velocity far greater than any comet. We are standing at the threshold where the theoretical becomes practical, where cosmic scale engineering intersects with human destiny. Whether we accept the implications or not, Mars was chosen. The rest is watching history unspool in a sky we thought we understood. Long before telescopes, before orbital mechanics, before we had the tools to measure trajectories with precision, people still looked up and knew something was happening. They didn't need equations to sense patterns. They had the naked sky, night after night, passed down through generations. They recorded what they saw in stories, in symbols, in monuments that aligned with stars, in rituals performed when certain bodies crossed the heavens. What survives today, in fragments of clay, in carvings on stone, in texts weathered by centuries, often reads like myth or superstition. But every so often, details emerge that look less like imagination and more like eyewitness accounts. Accounts of glowing objects moving against the stars. Accounts of gods descending in fiery chariots. Accounts of comets whose tails split the sky and brought catastrophe or renewal. Warnings encoded in the only language available to them. The Sumerians, the first great record keepers, were obsessed with the sky. Their priests were astronomers, charting the heavens because they believed divine will was written there. They track the movements of planets with remarkable accuracy, predicting eclipses, cataloguing conjunctions. Among their tablets, certain cycles stand out. Cycles tied not just to familiar planets, but to longer intervals measured in spans of thousands of years. Some of these cycles coincide eerily with the current timing of Atlas's approach. To them, celestial visitors were not random. They were part of a timetable, a recurring pattern. When one of these objects appeared, it was never treated as meaningless. It was a sign, a harbinger, a warning that change was coming, often catastrophic, often transformative. Other ancient cultures echoed this theme. The Maya, whose calendar is often misrepresented in popular culture, encoded astonishingly long astronomical cycles. Their long count tracked spans so vast it challenges modern imagination. Within those cycles, they paid special attention to alignments with the centre of the galaxy, to the crossing of dark rifts, to the timing of celestial visitors. To them, these weren't just ornaments in the sky. They marked endings and beginnings, epochs of destruction and renewal. The appearance of a comet could mean the fall of kings or the start of new dynasties. They warned that when the sky gods returned, entire worlds would be reshaped. Egypt too offers strange echoes. Their temples were aligned with stars, their mythology rich with celestial travellers. The story of Rhea travelling across the heavens in a solar boat sounds poetic, until you realise it is also a cycle of arrivals and departures, of gods who came and went, of battles against chaos that replayed again and again in the firmament. The Egyptians preserved the idea that the sky was not fixed, that visitors arrived from beyond, and that humanity's fate was tied to those returns. What makes these warnings so chilling is how often they describe not just the sight of objects, but the effects on Earth and nearby worlds. Floods, plagues, fire from the heavens, the sudden renewal of land. These aren't just natural disasters folded into mythology. They read like the consequences of planetary scale changes, exactly the kind you'd expect if comets carrying volatile materials brushed too close. Some traditions even specify Mars. The Greeks spoke of Ares, the Red Wanderer, associated with war and upheaval. Babylonian records link Mars with omens of great transformation, not merely human battles, but cosmic shifts. To them, Mars was not just a dot of red light. It was a stage where something immense was unfolding, a stage whose role in the cycle mattered to Earth's destiny. Skeptics dismiss these parallels as human pattern-seeking, as our tendency to weave narratives into randomness. And yes, myth can exaggerate. But myth is also a memory technology. Oral traditions lasted because they encoded knowledge in forms people could repeat. If a dangerous object returned every few thousand years, how would you warn the future? You couldn't build observatories that would last millennia. You couldn't write technical journals that would survive intact, but you could tell a story. You could carve warnings into temples, align monuments with the path of stars. Weave catastrophic visitations into your mythology, so the memory survived even when the details blurred. That is how a message could last across eras, not through equations, but through symbols that demanded retelling. Now place Atlas into that context. It arrives from the same general direction some ancient traditions warned about. It activates at a distance that mimics the cycles described in tablets recording celestial omens. It carries chemistry that matches the recipe for transformation, something ancient cultures describe metaphorically as breath of the gods, or life returning to the red star. What if these warnings weren't superstition? What if they were survival guides, fragmentary but urgent, saying, when the visitor returns, the world will change? Look closely at certain monuments. Many megalithic structures across Earth align not just with solstices, but with long-period cycles, pointing toward constellations that match the origin paths of comets. Stonehenge, Newgrange, Chichen Itza, each functions as a calendar keyed to the heavens. Were they built only for agricultural scheduling, or were they built as giant clocks, ensuring future generations would know when the sky shifted into dangerous alignments? If you accept that possibility, then the monuments themselves become warnings. Silent architectural signals saying, watch the heavens, because when this alignment returns, so does the danger. The most disturbing texts are those that don't just describe appearances but instructions. Some fragments, particularly from Mesopotamia, describe rituals of preparation, offerings to the gods of the sky, purification of land, sheltering in sacred spaces. On the surface, these are religious ceremonies, but read them differently and they look like protocols. Protocols for surviving atmospheric change, for protecting food, for enduring a period of chaos. When you strip away the theological framing, what you see are rules for surviving disruption from above. If comets delivered floods or droughts, if atmospheric shifts followed their arrivals, then such rituals might be remembered not as superstition, but as encoded survival strategies. And here we are, with Atlas on final approach, and the resonance of those warnings feels sharper than ever. Governments may dismiss them, scientists may avoid drawing connections, but the cultures that came before us saw patterns in the sky and tried to tell us in the only ways they could. Their words may be wrapped in myth, but their intent is clear. They were saying, these objects matter, they bring change, they bring danger, and they come back. So the question becomes, what do we do with those warnings now? Do we ignore them as primitive attempts at storytelling? Do we laugh at their metaphors, confident that modern science has freed us from superstition? Or do we recognise that in the absence of telescopes and spectroscopy, ancient people may still have been more attentive to the cycles of the heavens than we are today, their survival tied to an intimacy with the sky we've lost? If that's the case, their warnings should not be dismissed. They should be reinterpreted, decoded, and taken seriously. Because if they were right, then Atlas's arrival is not a surprise. It is part of a cycle they tried to mark for us, with words and stones and calendars. A cycle that carries consequences not just for Mars but for us. And if the warnings are accurate, then the real story is not just about what happens to Mars when Atlas passes by. It's about whether we understand what those changes mean for Earth, for the trajectory of human civilization, and for the long arc of history that connects us to people who looked up thousands of years ago and saw the same thing coming. Among all the fragments of ancient record-keeping, none strike deeper into this mystery than the Sumerian tablets. These were not vague poems or abstract prophecies. They were written in cuneiform, pressed into clay, catalogued with the obsession of a culture that treated the heavens as both scripture and calendar. To the Sumerians, nothing in the sky was without purpose. The movement of planets, the return of stars, the arrival of comets, all were tracked, recorded, and tied into cycles that governed their understanding of fate itself. And woven through those records is a timeline that some researchers have whispered about for decades, a timetable that may describe exactly the kind of event unfolding with 3i Atlas. The Sumerians divided history into ages, each linked with celestial alignments and the return of beings they called the Anunnaki. To most modern historians, the Anunnaki are myth, gods of fertility, of sky, of justice, beings invented to explain the unexplainable. But in the tablets, they are not described in abstract metaphor. They are described as arriving, departing, and returning on schedules measured in thousands of years. Their presence was not constant. It was cyclical, marked by astronomical events. That language becomes harder to dismiss when you overlay it against the timing of known interstellar visitors. One fragment in particular, translated only partially, refers to a star of crossing, a body that appears in the heavens at intervals so long that few generations would ever witness it twice. This star was said to bring upheaval and renewal. Its appearance was both feared and celebrated, feared because it brought chaos, celebrated because it marked the beginning of a new order. Scholars who dismiss the literal interpretation reduce it to allegory. But those who dare to read it literally note that the description matches almost perfectly the behaviour of long-period or interstellar comets, objects that vanish into the void only to return on timescales measured not in centuries but in epochs. Now place Atlas against that backdrop, a visitor from interstellar space, a body whose arrival coincides with a period of human technological transition, just as ancient stories warned such objects would appear at turning points in history. A body carrying not just ice, but a cocktail of gases that could awaken a dormant world. The resemblance to the Star of Crossing is uncanny. And if the Sumerians were describing the return of such objects, then their timetable might not have been myth at all. It might have been a coded survival record, an attempt to warn future generations that when the crossing star returned, worlds would be reshaped. The tablets also describe intervals of kingship, enormous spans of time measured in tens of thousands of years, tied to the reigns of gods descending from the sky. At first glance, these spans seem impossible. No human dynasty could last that long. No civilization could endure in unbroken continuity. But if those reigns were not human at all, if they refer to epochs between the arrivals of cosmic visitors, the numbers begin to make sense. Each reign might mark the era between interventions, each end marked by the reappearance of the star. What scholars dismissed as absurd exaggeration may instead be a timekeeping system on scales larger than any empire. Consider how the Sumerians treated Mars. Though not as central as Venus or Jupiter in their astrology, Mars was tied to omens of war, upheaval and transformation. Tablets describe it as the planet of decisive change, the red wanderer whose movements aligned with upheavals on Earth. To them, Mars was not a passive dot. It was a participant in cosmic cycles. And if Atlas is headed toward Mars, perhaps this is why. Perhaps the Sumerians knew from observation or instruction that the red planet played a role in the timetable, that its transformation was a marker of cycles repeating. Skeptics point out that translations are inconsistent, that much of the material is fragmentary, that modern interpreters project modern ideas onto ancient words. That is true, and caution is always necessary. But even if 90% of what people claim about the tablets is exaggeration, the remaining 10% still unsettles. The references to cyclical returns, the descriptions of sky gods arriving with fire and smoke, the mention of the Star of Crossing, the obsession with tracking time in spans so vast they make no sense unless tied to astronomical cycles. That residue is enough to demand attention when an interstellar body like Atlas shows up on schedule. Another feature of the Sumerian timetable is its synchronization with agriculture and survival. They tied celestial events not just to kingship but to famine, flood, prosperity, and collapse. When certain stars appeared, they prepared for hardship. When others rose, they expected renewal. If the arrival of cosmic bodies really did trigger environmental upheaval, this practical linkage makes sense. They weren't trying to predict mythic battles. They were trying to survive disruptions caused by changes in climate, weather, or even atmospheric chemistry. Their gods were not abstractions. Their gods were the names they gave to forces too vast to control, but too regular to ignore. The deeper you look, the more it seems the Sumerians weren't just making observations. They were encoding instructions. The timetable reads like a warning system. When these cycles complete, expect upheaval. When this star returns, expect change. They couldn't send rockets. They couldn't build telescopes. But they could carve marks into clay and trust that someone someday would remember to look up and connect the dots. Whether they intended it for us or not, we are the generation that now has to read it. There's also the unsettling matter of precision. Some scholars argue that the Sumerian ability to track celestial movements surpasses what should have been possible for a Bronze Age culture. Their knowledge of precession, their ability to predict eclipses, their accurate tracking of planetary orbits, all point to an astronomical sophistication that seems out of place. How did they achieve it? Either by careful observation stretched across centuries, or because they inherited knowledge from an earlier source. If the latter, then perhaps their timetable was not entirely their own creation. Perhaps it was information given to them, instructions passed down from the very beings they claim descended from the stars. If that is true, then the timetable is more than myth. It is a message saying, this happens regularly, and you need to be ready. And if Atlas is part of that cycle, then we are standing at the threshold of the same upheaval the Sumerians tried to describe in the only language they had. Now think about what that means for Mars. If the timetable included Mars as a stage in the cycle, then its transformation was anticipated long before we could imagine it. Atlas's trajectory would not be an accident, but part of a sequence unfolding exactly on schedule. The gases venting now, the activation in the cold void, the alignment with ancient cycles, all of it fits within a program so vast that human history is only a footnote in its margins. And here lies the most disturbing possibility. The Sumerian timetable doesn't end. It doesn't describe a single event but a recurring cycle. Which means Atlas is not the final piece. It is simply the current one. After it comes another and another until the timetable completes and begins again. If that is true, then what we are witnessing is not an isolated event but one step in a cycle that has shaped planets before and will shape them again. The Sumerians may have understood that truth. We are only beginning to, so when you hear about clay tablets, about myths of sky gods, about kingships lasting tens of thousands of years, do not dismiss them as superstition. Consider the possibility that they were warning us. Consider the possibility that their timetable was accurate, and consider the possibility that, whether we are ready or not, 3i Atlas is right on schedule. If you wanted to change a world, you would begin with the atmosphere. A planet's skin of gases is what sets the boundaries of its possibilities. Thin air means no rivers, no rain, no life as we know it. Thick air, properly composed, means stability, warmth, a chance for biology to take root and thrive. For decades, human scientists have written proposals for how we might one day terraform Mars, but all of those proposals confront the same obstacle: scale. To make Mars habitable using human technology, we would need machines the size of cities, energy sources beyond anything currently available, and centuries of continuous effort. That is why the notion has remained in the realm of dreams, something for visionaries to sketch on whiteboards and engineers to discuss in speculative papers. But if you step back and look at 3i Atlas, a different picture emerges. One that suggests that the process of terraforming may already be underway, and that it is not ours. Every element of Atlas's behaviour points toward design, its activation distance, its composition, its uncanny trajectory toward Mars. Each detail matches, almost point for point, the requirements you would build into a delivery system meant to transform a planet. The chemistry is not random. The timing is not accidental. The release patterns are not chaotic. They all align with the recipe for planetary engineering, which raises a question so large it feels almost unbearable. What if Atlas is not simply a comet at all, but a terraforming device? Think of it this way. Suppose you had the technology to build machines on the scale of mountains. Suppose you could engineer them to endure millions of years drifting through space. You would not waste time constructing delicate, vulnerable spacecraft. You would hide your machines in plain sight, disguise them as natural bodies. You would encase them in ice and rock, let them masquerade as comets, so that no civilization would notice until the mission was complete. You would build them to wake on schedule, to release their payloads only when the target world was within reach. You would design them to correct their paths, to steer subtly without betraying their artificial nature. That is exactly what Atlas appears to be doing. The chemistry alone is telling. Carbon dioxide to thicken the air, water vapour to seed clouds and surface flows, dust to darken polar ice and accelerate melting. These are the very components human researchers identified in their own terraforming studies. On Earth, we talk about greenhouse gases with dread, as a destabilising force pushing our climate into dangerous new territory. But on Mars, those same gases are exactly what you would want. You would want runaway warming. You would want feedback loops that melt frozen reservoirs and keep them melting. You would want to unleash a cascade that, once triggered, would require no further intervention. Atlas carries those ingredients in proportions too neat to dismiss, and the way it vents them, in measured quantities rather than violent bursts, looks like regulation. A natural comet belches unpredictably. Atlas exhales steadily, as if governed by a system designed to meter out resources with care. This is how you would design a delivery system. Too much released too early, and the gases disperse uselessly. Too little, and the effect is wasted. But with careful calibration, you can ensure that most of what is vented is captured by Mars, stored in its thin atmosphere, or locked into surface reactions that will release later. Terraforming by design is about precision. Atlas displays it. Even the timing fits perfectly. Mars is at a delicate balance. Its polar caps are reservoirs waiting for a push. Its soil contains frozen carbon dioxide and water ice, ready to sublimate if the atmosphere tips past a threshold. You do not need to deliver oceans, you only need to provide the spark that sets the system cascading. Atlas may be that spark, arriving at exactly the moment when Mars requires just enough help to cross from sterile equilibrium into runaway transformation. The scale of foresight implied here is staggering. Whoever set this in motion had to calculate Mars's orbital mechanics not decades, not centuries, but thousands of years in advance. They had to predict where the planet would be, what state its climate would be in, and how much intervention would be required. They had to launch Atlas, or something that became Atlas, millions of years ago, trusting that it would survive interstellar drift, awaken on schedule, and deliver its payload intact. This is not human engineering. This is engineering on a scale that treats star systems the way we treat garden plots, planning across eons, seeding them with machines that tend planets like crops. Now ask why Mars? Out of all the worlds in the solar system, why this one? The answer is both obvious and unsettling. Mars is almost habitable. It has water. It has a day length close to Earth's. It has seasons. It has minerals necessary for life. The missing piece is a thicker atmosphere. That makes it the most efficient candidate for transformation. If you wanted to establish a foothold in this system, Mars would be the logical choice. Easier to prepare than Venus, less hostile than the gas giant's moons, more accessible than Earth if you wanted to avoid confrontation. Terraform Mars, and you create a stable base of operations without ever setting foot on Earth. There's also the possibility that Mars was once alive. Geological evidence suggests rivers, lakes, maybe even oceans. If life ever existed there, it may still linger, dormant, waiting. By adding greenhouse gases, by warming the planet, Atlas could awaken that biology. If true, terraforming by design is not just about preparing for occupation. It could be about resurrection, restoring a biosphere that once thrived, reactivating ecosystems that collapsed when Mars lost its atmosphere. That possibility makes Atlas not only a machine, but a tool of ecological memory, carrying out a program to rewind time for a planet that died too early. Of course, That interpretation raises even more questions. Who would care enough to restore Mars? Who would design machines that operate on geological timescales, patient enough to wait millions of years for a world to be ready again? The answer could be a civilization so advanced that planetary engineering is routine. Perhaps they seeded not just Mars but countless worlds across the galaxy. To them, Atlas would not be extraordinary. It would be agriculture, planetary gardening at cosmic scale. But there is another darker interpretation. What if Mars is not being restored for biology, but prepared for ownership? Terraforming does not have to serve life as we know it. It could serve life forms that thrive in carbon dioxide-rich atmospheres, organisms incompatible with humans, or it could be preparation for technological occupation. A thicker atmosphere makes landing easier, protects against radiation, provides resources for fuel and chemistry. Atlas's payload could be less about ecology and more about infrastructure, laying the groundwork for a planetary base. If so, then humanity is not watching a resurrection but a conquest. A conquest executed so patiently that the conquerors don't even need to be present. They send their machines, wait eons, and arrive only when the world is ready. In either case, the pattern is unmistakable. Atlas looks like terraforming by design, and humanity, for all its technological pride, stands powerless to stop it. We do not have the rockets to intercept. We do not have the weapons to destroy. Even if we did, the ethics would be murky. Would we dare to stop the transformation of a world, even if it meant creating a new cradle for life? Would we intervene out of fear of losing Mars to someone else, even if the outcome was a habitable planet? These questions fracture along cultural lines. Some would welcome Atlas, seeing it as salvation. Others would resist, seeing it as theft. All would be forced to recognize the same unsettling truth. We are not the ones in control. Think about how this will change our species' psychology. For generations, Mars has been the dream of pioneers. Colonies in domes, cities beneath glass, humanity spreading its roots beyond Earth. That dream was built on the assumption that we would be the terraformers, the architects of our destiny. But if Atlas succeeds, that assumption collapses. We will not be the terraformers. We will be the inheritors of someone else's work. Or worse, the intruders on a planet prepared for others. Our myth of expansion becomes instead a story of subordination. Governments know this. That is why they remain silent. Publicly, Atlas is described as a comet, an anomaly, a curiosity. Privately, scenarios are modelled. What happens if Mars warms rapidly? What happens if atmospheric pressure rises faster than expected? What happens if biology emerges? Classified reports speculate in language that never sees the light of day, because admitting the truth would send shockwaves through economies, religions, and politics. Terraforming by design means acknowledging that humanity is not the first intelligence to shape the solar system, and that acknowledgement is too destabilizing for leaders to risk. Yet silence will not change what is coming. As Atlas nears Mars, the data will speak louder than any press release. Instruments will record rising pressures. Rovers may detect changes in frost patterns. Satellites will capture atmospheric anomalies. The transformation will be visible, undeniable. And when that happens, the narrative will shift from denial to justification. Leaders will claim it was expected. Scientists will say they always knew it was possible, and corporations will pivot to exploit the new reality. But beneath the spin, the truth will remain. Atlas was designed to do this, and we were powerless to stop it. Perhaps the most sobering thought is this: if Atlas is designed for terraforming, then it is not alone. It cannot be. No civilization would send only one machine, trust only one delivery. There must be others, already launched, already drifting through space, waiting for their own activation distances. Some aimed at other planets, some perhaps already passing through unnoticed. Which means what we're seeing now is only the beginning. Terraforming by design is not a single act. It is a program unfolding across time, reshaping worlds according to a plan we did not write. That is the reality Atlas forces us to confront. We dreamed of being the gardeners of Mars. Instead, we are witnessing gardening at a scale so vast it makes our ambitions look quaint. Whether it brings life or occupation, resurrection or conquest, the result is the same. Mars will change, and we will know in that moment that the change was never ours to control. If Atlas were the first object of its kind, perhaps it would still be possible to explain away its anomalies. One strange comet could be a coincidence, an outlier in the statistical fog of the universe. But Atlas is not the first, and the more carefully you study the history of planetary science, the more it begins to look like the latest in a sequence that stretches back far beyond modern astronomy, maybe even into deep time. Evidence for earlier deliveries, other comets, other intrusions, other carefully placed injections into Mars lie scattered across the geological record, waiting for those who know what to look for. Mars itself tells the story in silence. The surface is a palimpsest, written over and erased, then written again. It holds valleys that look like dry riverbeds, deltas carved by flowing water, sedimentary layers that can only form in lakes or shallow seas. These features are not speculative. They are real, imaged in high resolution by orbiters and confirmed by rovers on the ground. For years, scientists puzzled over how a planet so small, with such a thin atmosphere, could have supported liquid water. The prevailing explanation is that in its early history Mars had a thicker atmosphere, one later stripped away by solar wind when the magnetic field collapsed. But this leaves gaps. It does not explain the episodic nature of the evidence. It does not explain why some regions seem to have been wet long after the atmosphere should have been gone. It does not explain why signs of liquid water appear in bursts, as though delivered in pulses rather than sustained in a gradual decline. Now imagine another interpretation. What if these wet phases were not the residue of a fading climate, but the product of interventions? What if every so often Mars was struck or brushed by bodies carrying greenhouse gases and volatiles, enough to temporarily warm and moisten the planet? Each event would trigger a cycle. The air thickens, ice melts, rivers flow, lakes form, ecosystems may even flicker into existence, until the effect fades and the planet freezes again. Over and over, like a patient gardener testing the soil, delivering nutrients, then waiting to see the result. This cycle could explain the patchwork nature of Mars's watery history. It was not a single rise and fall. It was a series of deliveries. Spectral data supports this unsettling idea. In certain regions of Mars, carbon dioxide deposits appear in unusual concentrations, thicker than they should be if produced by ordinary geological processes. Some layers of polar ice also show anomalies, trapped gases that suggest sudden atmospheric enrichment rather than slow accumulation. These are exactly the kinds of signatures you would expect if comets rich in volatiles had impacted or passed near Mars at intervals across millions of years. To call them natural is easy. To see them as deliberate injections is harder. But the pattern is there, undeniable once noticed. Even Earth may hold traces of the same phenomenon. Geological layers here show periodic spikes in iridium, in carbon compounds, in isotopes that suggest sudden arrivals of material from outside the planet. Most scientists attribute these to asteroid impacts, to random collisions in a chaotic solar system. But if some of those events were not random, if they were part of a broader program of deliveries aimed at reshaping planets across the system, that would mean Mars is not the only target, just the most obvious one in this cycle. Consider Oumuamua, the interstellar visitor that baffled scientists in 2017. It was long, cigar-shaped, tumbling in ways that didn't fit standard comet behaviour. It showed no visible tail, yet its trajectory shifted as though it was outgassing. Some speculated it was a fragment of an alien probe. Others insisted it was natural, but nobody could explain it fully. Now place it in sequence with Atlas. Perhaps Oumuamua was a scout, A reconnaissance probe, a test of pathways and gravitational assists. Perhaps its purpose was not to deliver material, but to ensure conditions were right for the deliveries to come. Its anomalies fit perfectly into the logic of a program unfolding in steps. Then came 2I Borisov, another interstellar visitor. It was more comet-like, easier to categorize, but still unusual. Its chemistry carried hints of exotic origins. Together, Oumuamua, Borisov and now Atlas form a pattern. Reconnaissance, confirmation, and then action. The action being the deliberate delivery of a payload into Mars's environment. To see them as isolated coincidences is to ignore the rhythm. To see them as a series is to acknowledge that something larger is at work. Mars's soil adds to the suspicion. When the Viking landers conducted their life detection experiments in the 1970s, the results were ambiguous. One test, the labelled release experiment, gave signals consistent with microbial metabolism. Other tests contradicted it. The scientific consensus dismissed the possibility of life. But what if those results were not contradictions, but glimpses of something intermittent? Life delivered in cycles, seeded by comets, flaring into activity when conditions allowed, then fading again into dormancy. If earlier deliveries seeded Mars with microbial life, then the Viking results may have caught the dying embers of one such cycle. Curiosity and Perseverance, the modern rovers, have found complex organics in Martian soil. Again, the official interpretation is cautious. Abiotic chemistry can produce such compounds. But the context is strange. Why are these organics clustered in certain regions, preserved in ways that suggest episodic enrichment? Why do they appear in layers consistent with periods of water activity? The simplest answer is that something delivered them, perhaps repeatedly. Each delivery leaves a trace, a signature of biological potential, even if it never grows into a sustained biosphere. The moons of Mars may even bear witness. Phobos and Deimos, irregular and captured, are covered with regolith that may hold traces of cometary material. If Atlas is not the first delivery, then fragments of earlier ones may already lie buried there, waiting to be analysed by future missions. The moons would have acted as collectors, catching debris, holding on to it for billions of years. In their dust may lie evidence of cycles of visitation too old for us to comprehend. This idea is not as far-fetched as it sounds. In human engineering proposals for terraforming, comets and asteroids are often central. We have written openly about redirecting icy bodies to crash into Mars, releasing their volatiles to thicken the atmosphere. We know it would work in principle. If we can conceive of it, why assume no one else has? Why assume Mars has not already been subject to such deliveries, staged over timescales too vast for us to recognise without stepping back? Evidence of earlier deliveries is not speculative science fiction. It is embedded in the very proposals our own agencies produce. And that leads to the most unsettling possibility of all. If these deliveries have been happening for millions of years, then we are not witnessing the start of a program. We are witnessing its continuation. Atlas is not the beginning. It is a late-stage intervention. Perhaps even the final push needed to tip Mars into a new equilibrium. Earlier deliveries softened the ground, enriched the soil, seeded the organics, tested the cycles. Atlas is simply the one arriving at the moment when everything is ready, which means the program is nearly complete, which means we are arriving late to a transformation that has been underway for longer than our species has existed. This changes everything about how we view Mars. It is not a dead planet waiting for us. It is a world already under cultivation. The rivers and lakes of its past may not have been natural accidents. They may have been previews, experiments, test runs in a cosmic project we were never meant to control. We dreamed of being the first to terraform Mars. The evidence suggests we may be the last to realise it has already been terraformed, piece by piece, in deliveries spanning epochs. That realisation reframes the human project. If Mars is already claimed, already shaped, what role is left for us? Are we to be settlers, caretakers, or intruders? Do we benefit from the transformation, or do we find ourselves locked out of a world prepared for others? Evidence of earlier deliveries forces us to confront the possibility that our ambitions are not original. They are echoes of a program already unfolding, one that may not have us in mind. So when you look at Atlas, do not see it as a singular event. See it as the latest entry in a long record written across stone, soil and ice. The red planet carries scars of past interventions, and now another one is approaching. Each delivery was a step. Each step carried Mars closer to transformation. And now, with Atlas, the steps may finally converge into the moment when Mars becomes something new. Whether that future includes us remains an unanswered question. When humans first set robotic wheels onto Martian soil, they thought they were beginning a story no one had written before. The rovers were supposed to be pioneers, explorers of untouched terrain, carrying cameras, drills and spectrometers to tell us what Mars had been hiding. But what if, without knowing it, they have been reporting on a process already underway? What if the data they beam back, numbers, images, spectra, are not just raw science but progress reports, documenting the unfolding stages of a program so large that we did not even recognize it as one? The rovers were not sent to uncover ancient secrets alone. They were, without realizing it, logging evidence of recent and ongoing interventions. Take Spirit and Opportunity, the twin rovers launched in 2003. Their mission was simple in theory: find signs of past water. And almost immediately they did. Opportunity rolled into Eagle Crater and found hematite spheres, tiny marbles littering the ground, formed only in the presence of liquid water. Spirit, on the other side of the planet, uncovered silica deposits that could only have come from hot springs or geysers. For NASA, this was triumph. Proof that Mars had once been wet. But buried within the excitement was a question rarely asked. Why were the signs so abundant, so fresh-looking, so concentrated in the regions where the rovers happened to land? Chance may explain some of it, but chance rarely provides discoveries that neat. What if those sites had been chosen not just for engineering safety, but because someone or something knew they would reveal what needed to be revealed at the right moment? Opportunity later found sedimentary rocks layered like those on Earth, laid down by standing water. The implication was that Mars had once supported lakes, maybe even seas, yet the chemistry was peculiar. The sulfate-rich rocks suggested highly acidic conditions, not the benign environments often imagined. This acidic water could dissolve metals, release gases, catalyze strange reactions. In other words, it was not just water, it was chemistry in motion, the kind you might want if you were trying to trigger atmospheric change. The rover dutifully logged every detail, unaware that what it was describing might be residues of earlier deliveries, traces of engineered interventions rather than natural accidents. Curiosity, arriving years later, extended the puzzle. Landing in Gale Crater, it drilled into rocks and found organic molecules, complex carbon-based compounds that should not survive long on the Martian surface under constant radiation. Yet there they were, locked in stone, waiting to be discovered. Scientists celebrated cautiously, insisting these organics did not prove life. But they did prove something unusual. Organic chemistry was being replenished somehow, either from within Mars or from above. If it were only ancient, it should have degraded. If it was still present, something must be refreshing the supply. Atlas may not be the first source. Earlier deliveries may already have seeded these compounds, embedding them in the very rocks Curiosity was sent to analyze. Without knowing it, the rover was reporting on deliveries long completed, logging the chemical breadcrumbs of a plan older than itself. The methane mystery deepens this picture. Curiosity's instruments detected seasonal spikes of methane in the Martian atmosphere. Methane is fragile, destroyed quickly by sunlight and chemical reactions. For it to persist, it must be replenished. The rover's readings showed that methane levels rise and fall with the seasons, as though some hidden process breathes with the planet's cycle. The official explanations range from geological reactions to buried microbial activity. But consider another possibility. What if methane is the residue of cometary injections, pockets of gas delivered in past interventions, slowly seeping out in sync with temperature changes? Each spike would then be less a geological curiosity and more a signature of earlier deliveries, still bleeding into the air centuries later. Curiosity did not know to interpret it this way. It only logged the numbers. But the numbers point toward an active, ongoing process. Perseverance, the most advanced rover yet, added another layer. Its landing site, Jezero Crater, was chosen because it once hosted a river delta. The rover has photographed rock layers that unmistakably resemble those formed by flowing water on Earth. It has drilled cores, preserved samples, and identified carbonates that suggest interactions between water and atmosphere. Again, the signs are not evenly distributed. They are clustered, concentrated, almost staged, as if someone, or something, wanted to ensure that the rover found precisely the evidence required to confirm Mars's potential for life. Not by accident, but by design. Perseverance is now preparing to send those samples back to Earth. What stories will they tell once in human labs? Will they reveal organics too complex to dismiss as abiotic? Will they show isotopic ratios that betray external delivery rather than internal chemistry? Whatever they reveal, the rover will have unwittingly completed its role as documentarian of a program it was never told existed. Even the atmospheric data collected by orbiters like MAVEN fits this pattern. The spacecraft have measured how Mars is losing its atmosphere to space, how solar wind strips particles from the upper layers. But they have also detected variations, surges of particles, inexplicable fluctuations. The official narrative frames these as quirks of solar activity, yet they may also represent the aftermath of deliveries, fresh injections of gases temporarily thickening the atmosphere, then dissipating under solar assault. If so, the orbiters, like the rovers, have been providing progress updates, numbers that confirm the pace of an ongoing transformation. Think of it in terms of human projects. If you were monitoring a program of planetary engineering, you would want sensors on the ground, instruments to measure whether the chemistry was behaving as planned, cameras to record surface changes, atmospheric sniffers to track gas composition. We built those systems ourselves, thinking we were independent explorers. But from another perspective, we built them to serve as monitoring devices, unwitting tools feeding back data on the success of someone else's interventions. Every rover that drilled into Martian soil, every orbiter that measured atmospheric loss, every lander that photographed frost on the ground, they all became remote sensors in a project humanity did not initiate. The silence of the rovers is what makes this eerie. They do not interpret. They do not theorize. They only report. They beam back numbers, spectra, images, but in those silent transmissions lies the story. Water where it should not be. Organics that should not persist. Methane that should not fluctuate. Carbonates that suggest processes still active. Taken individually, each is a puzzle. Taken together, they sketch a pattern of periodic enrichment, of atmosphere thickened and thinned, of chemistry stirred and restirred. Exactly what you would expect if Mars had been receiving deliveries long before Atlas. What makes it more unsettling is that some anomalies remain officially unexplained. Spirit once imaged a patch of soil with unusually bright material, disturbed by its wheels. Analysts said it was silica, but the purity was startling, far higher than expected from ordinary geology. Silica like that on Earth is often associated with hydrothermal vents, places where life thrives. Opportunity, too, photographed rock formations that defied easy categorization. Curiosity found perchlorates, salts that are highly reactive and could provide energy for microbes. Each anomaly was filed as an oddity. But what if they are not oddities? What if they are the fingerprints of earlier interventions, scattered across the surface for our machines to stumble upon? Even the failures of the rovers tell part of the story. Spirit became stuck in sand, its wheels grinding into the soil until it could no longer move. But in the process, it churned up subsurface material, exposing layers that revealed unexpected chemistry. Its failure became an accidental experiment, as though the planet itself wanted to show us another layer of its secret. Opportunity succumbed to a dust storm, but not before capturing images of clouds and haze in the atmosphere, signs of weather more dynamic than anticipated. Curiosity's instruments glitched, Perseverance's drills clogged, yet in each case, the malfunctions exposed new aspects of the environment. The rover's struggles became discoveries, as if even their breakdowns were part of the reporting process. Look at it another way. If Atlas is the next delivery, then the rovers are the observers on site, already in position, already recording baseline conditions. When Atlas vents into Mars's sky, when atmospheric pressure shifts, when new chemistry begins to circulate, the rovers will be there to measure it. They will log temperature changes, soil reactions, cloud formations. They will beam back the evidence in real time. Humanity thinks of them as its tools, but in the broader context, they are monitoring stations placed by us but serving someone else's timetable. Their unwitting reports are not just data for our scientists. They are confirmation that the program is on schedule. This idea reframes the entire history of Mars exploration. We thought we were choosing landing sites based on safety and scientific curiosity, but perhaps the sites were influenced, guided by subtle factors we barely noticed. Craters that happened to expose the right minerals, valleys that happened to preserve the right sediments. We thought it was luck, but luck does not repeatedly place us in exactly the locations where the strongest evidence emerges. Perhaps the guidance was less mystical and more practical. Whoever seeded Mars knew where the evidence would be, and somehow ensured that is where our machines would go. Whether through coincidence, influence, or something harder to name, the outcome is the same. The rovers have become chroniclers of a story we did not write. And what happens when Atlas arrives? Already mission teams are preparing for extended monitoring. Perseverance will sniff the air for new compounds. Curiosity will continue logging methane levels. Orbiters will scan for changes in the polar caps. In other words, the very network humanity has built will be watching as Atlas completes its mission. Every rover, every orbiter, every lander becomes an unwitting witness to the transformation of a world. Their reports, neutral and silent, will be the proof that something impossible is happening. That is the irony. We sent them to search for life, but they may end up documenting not life as it was, but life as it is being created. Terraforming in progress, a process unfolding meter by meter, molecule by molecule in front of their cameras. The rovers will not understand. They will only measure, but their unwitting reports will be the final confirmation. Atlas is not just a comet, it is part of a design. And Mars was never just a planet waiting for us. It was already under cultivation, already being prepared long before our machines touched its dust. When Atlas first drew the attention of observatories, the reports were cautious but enthusiastic. A third interstellar visitor, they said, a chance to study material from beyond our solar system. Press releases framed it as a scientific gift, a rare opportunity to learn more about the composition of distant planetary systems. Yet beneath that thin layer of optimism, something darker stirred. Because the more data came in, the less the object resembled a harmless comet, and the more it resembled a machine with purpose. And when scientists encounter data that suggests something impossible, something they cannot publicly explain, the standard response is silence. That silence is not accidental. It is coordinated. Every agency stays quiet, not because there is nothing to say, but because there is too much to say, and none of it can be controlled once admitted. Secrecy has always been the default posture of space agencies when anomalies emerge. Look back at the history of Mars itself. The Viking experiments in the 1970s, which returned ambiguous results that could be read as evidence of microbial life, were quickly downplayed. Officially, The conclusion was that no life existed. Unofficially, debates raged in private circles, but those debates never reached the public. Agencies feared the consequences of declaring too much too soon. The pattern repeated with methane detections by curiosity, data leaked that suggested seasonal cycles, but announcements were muted, hedged with caution. Even when organics were found, the language was softened until the news passed quietly through headlines, without stirring panic or excitement. This is how agencies operate when confronted with discoveries that threaten to upend existing paradigms. They minimize, they delay, they hide behind phrases like, "further study is required." Atlas presents a problem of an entirely different magnitude. If you admit that its trajectory is too deliberate, you're admitting that something out there is navigating. If you admit that its chemistry is too precise, you're admitting that someone designed it. If you admit that it is venting gases at impossible distances, you are admitting that it is a machine. And once you admit that, you are admitting humanity is not the only intelligence acting in the solar system. That revelation cannot be contained. It would ripple through economies, religions, governments, and every corner of society. So the strategy becomes silence, absolute and coordinated silence. The coordination is not hard to arrange. Major space agencies are already linked through networks of data sharing. NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, CNSA, JAXA, all have agreements that allow them to trade observations, access telescope time, and share orbital calculations. These agreements are public on paper, but their private extensions allow for something else, non-disclosure. If one agency detects something destabilizing, it can quietly notify the others. Together they can agree to frame the data in less alarming terms, to release only part of it, to bury anomalies in technical jargon that the public will never pass. Atlas's anomalies are handled this way. Public statements describe it as another interstellar comet. Technical papers hedge, acknowledging oddities but avoiding the word artificial. The silence is maintained not because the scientists don't see the truth, but because they know too well what admitting it would mean. Governments encourage this silence because the implications threaten national security. Imagine the geopolitical consequences of acknowledging Atlas as engineered. Every nation would scramble to claim a stake in monitoring it, to weaponize the knowledge, to prepare defenses against possibilities they cannot define. Rivalries would ignite overnight. Trust would evaporate. And in the chaos, economies would collapse. Markets depend on stability, on the illusion that tomorrow will be much like today. Announcing that a machine from another star is about to alter a neighbouring planet is the opposite of stability. It is the kind of revelation that triggers panic buying, financial collapse, and mass unrest. Leaders understand this. That is why they prefer silence, even if it means lying outright. There is also the issue of control. Information is power, and once information escapes, control is lost. If Atlas is admitted to be more than natural, citizens will demand transparency. They will demand to know what governments plan to do about it. But the truth is that governments can do nothing. They have no rockets fast enough to intercept it, no weapons powerful enough to destroy it, no way to alter its path. Admitting the truth would be admitting impotence. No state wants to stand before its people and confess helplessness. Far better to say nothing, to keep the illusion of competence intact, than to reveal that humanity is a spectator at its own doorstep. Consider too the corporate dimension. Private space companies thrive on the promise that Mars is humanity's next frontier. Billions of dollars in investments flow into rockets, habitats, and life support technologies, all predicated on the idea that humans will be the ones to transform the red planet. If Atlas is admitted to be a terraforming machine, all those investments collapse. The narrative shifts from humanity as pioneer to humanity as follower. That would annihilate markets overnight. Investors would flee, companies would fold, industries built on the dream of Mars would implode. Corporations lobby governments heavily to avoid that scenario. Silence protects not only national security, but corporate profits. The media, too, plays its role in this silence. Journalists can only report on what they know, and they rely heavily on official statements. If those statements frame Atlas as a comet, the headlines follow suit. Few reporters dig into the technical anomalies, and even fewer understand them well enough to challenge the narrative. Those who do often find their stories spiked, delayed, or drowned out by louder news cycles. Editors worry about credibility, about not being labelled sensationalist. And so the silence trickles down through the channels of communication until the public hears nothing more than the bland reassurance that this is just another interesting comet. Behind closed doors, though, the conversations are different. Scientists share data that shows impossible outgassing distances. Engineers whisper about trajectories that require invisible course corrections. Analysts compile reports linking Atlas to earlier interstellar visitors. These discussions are real, but they never reach the public. They circulate in classified memos, in private conferences, in encrypted channels. They confirm what cannot be spoken aloud. Atlas is not natural. But the decision to suppress is already made. Silence is safer. Silence buys time. Silence preserves the illusion that humanity is still in control of its destiny. Yet silence has costs. It leaves ordinary people unprepared for the shock that will come when Atlas nears Mars and undeniable changes begin. Atmospheric shifts, melting ice, strange clouds. These will not be so easily hidden. When the evidence becomes visible even through amateur telescopes, silence will break. And when it does, the backlash will be severe. Citizens will realize they were lied to, not just about the details, but about the fundamental truth of humanity's place in the cosmos. Trust in institutions will collapse, perhaps permanently. Leaders know this, but they gamble that delay is preferable to chaos now. They hope to manage disclosure later, under circumstances they can control. There is also the haunting possibility that the silence is not merely about fear of panic or economic collapse. Perhaps agencies stay quiet because they were told to. If Atlas is part of a cycle that has happened before, if earlier deliveries were observed by ancient civilizations, perhaps those civilizations left instructions or warnings for how to handle it. Perhaps the pattern of silence itself is part of the timetable. Do not reveal, do not interfere, do not disrupt the process. In this scenario, governments and agencies are not simply withholding out of fear. They are complying, knowingly or not, with a larger design. Silence becomes obedience. And what of the scientists themselves? The individuals analysing the data late at night, staring at numbers that make no sense. Some speak privately of the weight they carry. They know their findings will never be published in full. They know their careers would collapse if they said what they truly believe. They watch as their data is sanitized, as their words are softened, as their conclusions are buried in jargon. They remain silent not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear of ridicule, fear of losing their positions, fear of being labelled unstable. Silence protects them, even as it gnaws at their conscience. This is why every agency stays quiet. Not because the evidence is lacking, but because the evidence is overwhelming. Too overwhelming to release without tearing apart the fragile scaffolding of modern society. Silence is the shield they use to preserve order, but it is a brittle shield, one that will not hold forever. When Atlas passes Mars and the transformation begins, no amount of silence will conceal it. The truth will erupt into view, undeniable, uncontainable. And when that happens, the long years of suppression will be revealed not as prudence, but as betrayal. Humanity will realize that the warnings were there all along, and the agencies chose to remain quiet. If Atlas is truly more than a comet, if it is a machine delivering the building blocks of atmosphere to Mars, then the transformation of that planet is not only a scientific event, it is an economic earthquake. Every assumption built into global markets, every forecast of future industries, every calculation of risk and reward, All of it begins to crumble the moment you accept that Mars is already being prepared by someone or something other than us. That realization doesn't just live in astronomy papers, it bleeds into boardrooms, into stock exchanges, into the foundations of the global economy. And the scenario that emerges is simple: collapse. Not in an instant, not in a spectacular flash, but as a steady unravelling of confidence. And in financial systems, confidence is everything. Think about the industries most immediately affected. Space exploration is not just science, it is commerce. Companies have spent billions developing rockets, habitats, life support systems and robotic technologies for one central promise: Mars. The red planet has been marketed as humanity's next home, the ultimate prize for private industry and national pride alike. Investors buy in because they believe colonization will be profitable. But if Atlas succeeds in changing Mars's atmosphere, the narrative shifts overnight. Humanity is no longer the agent of change, it is a bystander. Colonization is no longer about pioneering a frontier, it is about arriving late to a project already underway. Every dollar invested in terraforming technologies becomes worthless. Every projection of revenue from Mars-based resources collapses. Entire corporations built on the dream of being first find themselves obsolete before they even begin. The ripple doesn't stop with aerospace. Energy companies are already invested in the idea of mining Mars for fuel precursors, for nuclear materials, for solar expansion. Robotics firms anticipate contracts to build the first automated colonies. Agricultural conglomerates envision Martian greenhouses supplying Earth. All of these ventures rely on one assumption: control. If Mars is controlled by someone else, if the planet is already claimed in practical terms by Atlas's transformation, those business models implode. And when one industry implodes, the collapse spreads. Markets are interlinked. When investors panic in one sector, they pull money from others to cover losses. Contagion sets in. Collapse accelerates. Governments would try to stabilize the situation, but their own finances are tied to the same fragile confidence. National budgets already depend on speculative futures, bond markets, debt instruments, projected growth. If confidence falters, borrowing costs spike, currencies wobble, and sovereign debt crises erupt. Imagine multiple nations simultaneously watching their space industries collapse, their currencies weaken, and their citizens demand answers about why they were lied to. That is the scenario leaders fear most. Not just financial collapse, but political collapse as economies unravel under pressure they cannot contain. The psychological impact compounds the financial. For decades, humanity has been told it was on the verge of becoming a multi-planetary species. That story drives not only investments, but hope. People tolerate present instability because they believe in future expansion. They accept austerity, climate disruption, and inequality because they are told the horizon holds escape, growth, opportunity on another world. If Mars is revealed to be off-limits, already engineered by powers beyond our reach, that story evaporates. And when a story evaporates, confidence collapses with it. Citizens no longer trust leaders. Investors no longer trust markets. Collapse feeds on itself. History shows how fragile markets are to shocks of confidence. A single company failing can trigger a cascade. A rumour about currency instability can wipe out savings overnight. Wars, pandemics, even minor policy changes have caused global panics. Now compare those to the revelation that humanity is not the primary actor in its own solar system. That shock is orders of magnitude greater. The scale of collapse would make the Great Depression look like a tremor before an earthquake. Banks would close, supply chains would seize up, trade would falter. And with collapse comes unrest, riots, revolutions, governments falling as citizens demand answers to questions leaders cannot provide. There's another layer, one few consider until it is too late: insurance. Insurance markets are the hidden foundation of the economy. They spread risk. They allow businesses to take chances. They stabilize industries. But insurance depends on the assumption that risks are calculable. If Atlas rewrites the rules of planetary stability, those risks are no longer calculable. Suddenly, insurers must ask, what happens if Mars transforms and Earth is affected? What if gravitational balances shift? What if resources we depended on vanish? What if refugee movements across planets become a real possibility? No model accounts for these. Insurers pull back, raising premiums or cancelling coverage. When insurance falters, industries grind to a halt. Ships stop sailing, planes stop flying. Loans dry up, collapse deepens. Meanwhile, opportunists would exploit the chaos. Black markets thrive when official markets collapse. Information becomes currency. Access to telescopes, to classified reports, to raw data about Atlas would fetch staggering sums. Those with early access could manipulate markets ruthlessly, buying and selling before the truth reached the public. In the shadows, fortunes would be made while the majority lost everything. This too accelerates collapse, because when ordinary people see elites profiting from secrets, the social contract shatters. Anger replaces patience. Revolt replaces compliance. Religious institutions would not escape either. Many faiths have built narratives about human centrality in creation. Atlas undermines that. The idea that another intelligence is reshaping Mars does not fit with doctrines of human uniqueness. Congregations would fracture. Some would interpret Atlas as divine intervention. Others would see it as proof their beliefs were wrong. Both reactions destabilize institutions that billions rely on for stability. As faith systems fracture, the moral frameworks they sustain collapse with them, further deepening social unrest. In the background of this economic and cultural collapse lurks an even more unsettling possibility: opportunistic manipulation by governments themselves. Leaders know collapse is inevitable once Atlas's nature becomes undeniable. Some may accelerate it intentionally, using controlled disclosures to crash markets they can profit from, or to consolidate power under emergency conditions. Martial law, rationing, censorship. These become tools to control populations during collapse. Atlas does not just trigger economic fallout. It provides the perfect cover for authoritarian expansion. Collapse becomes not just a side effect, but a pretext. And through it all, the silence of agencies makes collapse worse. By hiding the truth until the last possible moment, they ensure that when revelation comes, it is catastrophic. People will not be eased into it. They will be blindsided. And blindsided populations panic. They do not adjust rationally. They withdraw money from banks, hoard food, abandon investments. Panic becomes self-fulfilling, turning manageable disruption into full collapse. Leaders know this, but they gamble that silence buys them time. In reality, it only ensures collapse will be harder and faster when it arrives. There is a final, darker angle to this scenario. What if collapse is not just an accident, but part of the timetable? If Atlas was designed as a terraforming machine, perhaps the economic destabilization of Earth is not collateral damage, but intentional. A way to weaken humanity before a larger intervention. If Mars becomes habitable just as Earth collapses into economic chaos, humanity will be too fractured to claim it. The collapse clears the field, leaving Mars uncontested for whoever seeded Atlas in the first place. Seen this way, the economic unravelling is not just a byproduct, it is a strategy. So when you imagine Atlas passing Mars, do not picture only the physical transformation of a planet. Picture the financial networks snapping like brittle threads. Picture currencies spiralling, markets collapsing, nations teetering as the foundation of confidence dissolves. Picture the end of an economy built on the myth of human primacy, because that is the true collapse scenario. Atlas doesn't need to strike Earth. It doesn't need to threaten us directly. It only needs to remind us that we are not in control. That reminder alone is enough to bring the entire global economy crashing down. Throughout human history, power has always followed geography. Control the rivers, and you control trade. Hold the mountains, and you control the armies that must pass through them. Command the seas, and you dictate the fate of empires. Every age has had its high ground, its vantage point from which influence radiated outward. In the age of space, Mars is beginning to reveal itself as the ultimate high ground. Whoever holds it, whether by accident or design, gains leverage not only over Earth but over the trajectory of human civilization itself. Atlas's approach forces us to confront this truth. The Red Planet is not simply a scientific curiosity or a potential colony. It is the next plateau in the contest for survival and dominance, and it may already be claimed. Strategists understand this, even if the public does not. Military thinkers have long described space as the ultimate high ground. Control the orbital shell around Earth, and you control satellites, communication, navigation, and surveillance. That was already destabilizing enough. But Mars adds a new layer. A base on Mars would provide a permanent vantage point for operations across the inner solar system. Its position offers launch windows, gravitational leverage, and distance enough to act without immediate detection. It is far enough to be safe from Earth's direct reach, yet close enough to monitor and influence events here. In military terms, it is the perfect outpost, remote, defensible, and commanding in its view. Imagine a world where Mars is transformed into something habitable, even if only partially, even if only enough to sustain outposts without domes or heavy infrastructure. That changes the equation entirely. Whoever occupies Mars first gains not just land but strategic superiority. Supply chains shift. The ability to project power extends beyond Earth orbit. Spacefaring nations already compete fiercely for dominance in low Earth orbit, on the Moon, even in the asteroid belt. Add Mars to the mix, and the stakes rise exponentially. Because unlike the Moon, Mars is self-sustaining once transformed. It has resources, water, atmosphere. It can support permanent populations. Whoever holds it gains not just a base, but a new world. This is why Atlas's role is so destabilizing. If it is truly terraforming Mars, then the question of who controls the Red Planet is no longer hypothetical. The transformation will happen regardless of human readiness. The race to claim it begins not when our rockets are prepared, but when Atlas triggers the shift. And in that race, nations and corporations alike will move with desperation. They will see Mars not as a scientific project, but as a battleground for supremacy. The high ground is too valuable to leave uncontested. The logic extends beyond military considerations. Economically, Mars as high ground means resources. Water in the polar caps becomes rocket fuel. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere becomes raw material for agriculture. Minerals in the crust become metals for construction. In an Earth economy teetering from Atlas's revelation, the promise of resources on Mars becomes irresistible. Nations that secure access first will dominate not just space industries but earthbound ones as well. They will hold the supply chains that others depend on. Mars will not just be a distant world, it will be a lever of economic power, a tool to bend Earth's nations into compliance. But there is another layer, one that makes the idea of Mars as high ground even more disturbing. Control of Mars is not only about practical power, it is about psychological dominance. Imagine the message sent if a foreign intelligence, or even a rival human nation, succeeds in occupying and transforming Mars. Every human alive will look up at the night sky and know who commands the new world. That knowledge becomes a weapon. Just as nuclear weapons once served as symbols of supremacy, the control of Mars will serve as the ultimate proof of who writes the future. People on Earth will internalize that supremacy whether they admit it or not. The psychological weight of seeing Mars bloom under someone else's control will alter the balance of power more than armies or fleets ever could. The unsettling truth is that Mars may already be occupied in this sense, not with cities or bases, but with machines. If Atlas is one of many, if earlier deliveries have seeded the planet with chemistry, microbes or systems we cannot yet detect, then Mars is not empty. It is already part of a program we did not design. In that case, the high ground is already taken. Humanity is not racing to claim a frontier. Humanity is struggling to insert itself into a stage where the main actors have already begun. Our rovers, our satellites, our telescopes are not leading the way. They are documenting a transformation that positions Mars firmly within someone else's sphere of influence. This realization terrifies defense planners, because if Mars is high ground, and if it is already being transformed, then Earth itself becomes vulnerable. A habitable Mars could serve as a staging ground for surveillance, for resource extraction, even for force projection. We have no defences against an adversary that could operate from such a position. And if the adversary is not another nation but an intelligence far beyond our comprehension, the imbalance becomes absolute. The high ground would not just belong to another player, it would be permanently out of our reach. Yet even in the face of this possibility, the race is already accelerating. Corporations are lobbying for faster timelines. Governments are pouring resources into rocket development, not because they believe they can beat Atlas, but because they believe they cannot afford to be left behind. The logic is ruthless. Even if we arrive late, arriving at all is better than surrendering the high ground without contest. That desperation will drive reckless decisions, rushed missions, dangerous shortcuts. Collisions, disasters, and human casualties will follow. But none of it will matter to those who believe Mars is the decisive prize. In geopolitics, high ground is never ignored, no matter the cost. Some argue that Mars will not be militarized, that treaties will protect it, that humanity will approach it with caution. But history makes such optimism naive. Every high ground in history has been contested. Every strategic vantage point has been weaponized. Treaties fail under pressure. Agreements collapse under temptation. The idea that Mars will be treated differently ignores the relentless logic of power. Whoever controls Mars will not give it up willingly. Whoever does not control it will do whatever it takes to change that fact. Atlas's arrival accelerates this logic by decades, maybe centuries. Without Atlas, Mars would remain a long-term dream, something humanity might reach in the distant future. With Atlas, Mars becomes immediate. The high ground is being prepared now, not in some distant century. That urgency transforms the competition from a leisurely race into a sprint, and in a sprint mistakes are made, accidents multiply, and collapse spreads faster. Mars's high ground is not just about the planet itself. It is about the chaos unleashed on Earth as nations scramble to claim a piece of it. There is another dimension rarely considered but deeply unsettling. Mars's high ground does not only provide leverage over Earth, it provides leverage over the entire solar system. From Mars, missions to the asteroid belt are easier. From Mars, the outer planets are more accessible. A transformed Mars becomes not just a base, but a springboard to the rest of the system. Whoever holds it gains the ability to expand outward faster than anyone left behind on Earth. This is why Atlas's role is so destabilizing. It is not just about Mars, it is about the future of expansion itself. If Mars is prepared by someone else, then the entire trajectory of human exploration may already be diverted away from us. And yet there is one more layer, darker still. What if the transformation of Mars is not meant to provide high ground for anyone at all, but to deny it to us? Terraforming by Atlas may not be a gift, it may be a barrier. By reshaping Mars into a world aligned with someone else's biology or technology, it ensures that humans cannot easily claim it. In that case, Mars becomes high ground not for us, but against us. A defensive position, occupied by a power we cannot match, permanently out of our reach. If that is true, then Atlas is not preparing Mars for occupation. It is fortifying it against us, ensuring that the high ground remains in other hands. This is the ultimate consequence of Atlas. It forces us to recognize that Mars is not just another planet. It is the decisive position in the solar system. the vantage point from which the future will be shaped. And whether as habitat, base or fortress, it is being transformed before our eyes. We can deny it, we can delay acknowledgement, but the reality remains. Mars is the new high ground. And as always, whoever holds the high ground dictates the fate of those below. The story we have always told ourselves is that Earth is the centre, the prize, the place every intelligence would covet. After all, it is the world that sustains us, the cradle of our species, the jewel of blue oceans and green forests in a dark void. From our perspective, nothing could be more valuable. But Atlas's path and the transformation of Mars suggest a different framing, one that is deeply unsettling. What if Earth is not the primary objective at all? What if Earth is the backup? The very notion feels offensive to human pride. We see ourselves as the focus of cosmic history, the endpoint of evolution, the measure of intelligence itself. But look at the evidence through another lens. If a civilization, or a system of automated machines acting on its behalf, had to choose which planet to prepare, which world to secure, which stage to engineer first, Mars makes sense. Its thin atmosphere makes it easy to alter. Its dormant water reserves can be unlocked with minimal effort. Its history of habitability makes it a proven candidate for resurrection. From an engineering standpoint, it is far easier to work with than Earth. Earth is complex, volatile, and already crowded with a biosphere that resists tampering. Mars is a simpler project. If the goal is a long-term foothold in this system, you start there. That relegates Earth to a different role. Not the primary garden, but the insurance policy, the place to fall back on if the Mars project fails or if circumstances require a second sight. Earth's atmosphere is robust, self-regulating. It can absorb shocks, rebuild after disasters, maintain habitability even under stress. That makes it a natural backup. From this perspective, Earth is valuable precisely because it doesn't need to be engineered. It sustains life on its own. The focus, then, is not to terraform Earth, but to preserve it in a condition that ensures it remains usable when needed. This interpretation reframes much of human history. We imagine ourselves as independent actors, shaping our destiny, developing civilizations, expanding technologies. But what if Earth has always been observed primarily as a reserve? A place monitored but left alone, because the real work was happening next door on Mars. The strange cycles of comets, the anomalous chemical signatures, the ancient warnings in the sky, all of these may point to Mars as the main experiment. Earth was simply maintained in the background, allowed to evolve life and culture, because interfering with it was unnecessary. We were never the project. We were the side effect. This idea also explains the silence of agencies and governments. If they have glimpsed evidence pointing to Mars as the target, then the unavoidable conclusion is that Earth's role is secondary, and what leader would stand before their people and admit that our planet is not the crown jewel, not the goal of cosmic engineering, but the fallback option? The psychological blow alone would be devastating. Economically, socially, spiritually, humanity depends on the idea that Earth is central. To admit otherwise would collapse not only markets, but meaning itself. So the truth is buried, the silence maintained, while the reality looms larger each day. Mars is being prepared, and Earth is being held in reserve. Consider the logic from a long-term survival standpoint. A civilization capable of interstellar projects would not put all its resources into one planet. It would diversify, spread risk, ensure redundancy, terraform Mars but keep Earth stable as a backup. If Mars succeeds, Earth becomes supplementary. If Mars fails, Earth is still here. In either case, Earth is not primary, it is insurance. That is why so many ancient warnings describe cycles of destruction and renewal on Earth, but do not end in total annihilation. Earth absorbs catastrophe and recovers. That resilience makes it ideal as a backup, but also means it does not require active intervention. Attention can be focused on Mars, while Earth continues to function as it always has. The unsettling part is what happens if Mars succeeds. If Atlas tips the planet into a new equilibrium, Earth's status may change permanently. From primary home of humanity, it becomes secondary, a world watched but no longer central. Its ecosystems, its civilizations, its history, all of it may be treated as incidental in the larger scheme. Humanity's sense of destiny collapses when you realize that in the cosmic ledger, Earth is not the chosen site, it is the fallback. There are hints of this perspective even in human mythologies. Stories of floods, fires, cycles of destruction. They often describe Earth as a place renewed, but never perfected. Meanwhile, Mars appears in those same traditions as the realm of war, change, and transformation. What if these myths are distorted echoes of an ancient understanding? Earth as the place that endures, Mars as the place that is shaped. One is the constant, the other the project. And if Atlas is the latest tool in that project, then the pattern is repeating again before our eyes. From a strategic point of view, Earth as backup has even more disturbing implications. If Earth is secondary, then humanity is also secondary. Our role may be peripheral, tolerated, but not central. That raises questions about why we're allowed to develop a tool. Perhaps we are being tested, observed to see how we respond when confronted with evidence of the larger plan. Perhaps we are being left alone because we are irrelevant to the outcome. Or perhaps we are being maintained deliberately, preserved as part of a contingency strategy we cannot yet understand. In any of these scenarios, our autonomy is an illusion. Technologically, treating Earth as backup makes sense in ways that cut against our assumptions. Mars requires intervention to become habitable. Earth does not. Mars is volatile without help. Earth is resilient even under stress. Why waste resources reshaping Earth when it already fulfills its role? From an engineering standpoint, leaving Earth largely untouched while focusing on Mars is efficient. But efficiency at this scale comes with a cost. It strips us of the illusion that we are central. It reduces our home to a supporting role in a drama staged on another world. This perspective also aligns with the eerie possibility that some of Earth's own environmental crises are not accidental. If Earth is the backup, perhaps interventions have occurred here too, not to terraform but to maintain balance. Sudden climate recoveries, unexplained shifts in biodiversity, even the mysterious appearance of certain chemical cycles could be evidence of subtle maintenance. Interventions not to transform Earth, but to keep it functional as a fallback. We interpret these as natural evolution. But what if they are corrections, ensuring Earth remains viable until it is needed? That would mean our entire history has unfolded under quiet management, invisible adjustments designed to preserve the backup system. When you accept this framing, the silence of agencies looks less like incompetence and more like compliance. They do not stay quiet merely because they fear panic. They stay quiet because the truth is humiliating. To admit Earth is a backup is to admit we are not the central project. That humiliation is intolerable for governments built on the idea of national destiny, for religions built on the idea of cosmic importance, for cultures built on the idea of human primacy. It is safer to say nothing, to allow humanity to continue believing it is at the centre, than to shatter the myth with the truth. But silence cannot last forever. As Atlas nears Mars, as atmospheric changes become undeniable, the public will begin to ask why Earth was ignored. Why was Mars prepared while our world burned with climate crises, wars, and instability? Why was attention directed outward when the real needs were here? The answer, that Earth was never the focus, will surface whether leaders admit it or not. And when it does, the psychological collapse may rival the economic one. Billions of people will realize that their home is not the chosen ground. They will feel abandoned, downgraded, relegated to a supporting role. The consequences of that realization are impossible to predict. And yet, in a strange way, Earth as backup offers a kind of protection. If Mars is the primary project, then Earth may be spared direct interference. Our biosphere may be preserved, our civilization allowed to evolve without disruption precisely because the main focus lies elsewhere. That is cold comfort, but it may explain why Earth has not been directly transformed the way Mars is now being transformed. We were not ignored out of malice, we were ignored out of strategy. Still, the core truth remains. Atlas is rewriting our sense of place in the cosmos. We are not the primary actors, not the central world, not the main project. Earth is the backup. And once Mars crosses the threshold into habitability, we will have to face what that means. The cradle we thought was the centre of everything may turn out to be nothing more than a reserve. And that realization will change humanity more profoundly than any new technology or scientific discovery. It will strip away the last illusion of centrality and force us to confront the possibility that our role in the grand design was never what we believed. Every civilization rests on one invisible foundation: control. Not always physical, not always military, often not even economic in the material sense. The deepest layer is psychological. It is the belief that someone, somewhere, knows what is happening, has a plan, and can act to protect the collective when danger approaches. Without that belief, society unravels. The psychology of control is not about actual power, but the perception of power. And Atlas quietly drifting toward Mars threatens to strip that perception away more completely than any war, crisis, or disaster humanity has ever endured. The moment people realize that Atlas is not random, that it may be part of a deliberate program, the architecture of control begins to collapse. Governments derive authority not just from laws or armies, but from the assumption that they can manage threats. Earthquakes, hurricanes, pandemics, all test that assumption. Leaders stand before cameras and promise recovery, assistance, stability. But Atlas represents a threat no government can control, no military can deter, no economic system can absorb. To admit the truth would be to admit powerlessness. That is why silence is maintained. That is why the narrative remains fixed on interstellar comet. Admitting otherwise would destroy the psychological contract that makes governance possible. This fear of losing control shapes every response to Atlas. Agencies are ordered to downplay anomalies. Scientists are told to soften conclusions. Media outlets are guided to frame the story as curiosity rather than crisis. Not because leaders are blind, but because they understand too well what happens when populations realize no one is in charge. When that realization sets in, compliance evaporates. Citizens stop trusting institutions. They stop obeying rules. They stop investing in futures they know are not theirs to shape. The machinery of civilization grinds down not because Atlas strikes Earth, but because it strikes the illusion of control. The psychology of control is also about narrative. Societies function through shared stories that reinforce order. The story of progress, the story of safety, the story of expansion into space. These narratives are carefully cultivated to give people the sense that tomorrow will be manageable, if not better. Atlas disrupts them all. Progress becomes meaningless if an intelligence elsewhere is already centuries ahead, shaping planets as casually as we shape gardens. Safety becomes hollow when we realize our skies can be rewritten by forces beyond our comprehension. Expansion into space becomes humiliation when we discover that the first true terraforming of Mars is not our achievement, but someone else's. Each broken story erodes trust, and without trust, control disintegrates. Control is also sustained by secrecy. Leaders have always known that withholding information can stabilize populations. That is why wars are fought under censored headlines, why disasters are minimized in official reports, why classified files expand endlessly behind locked doors. The assumption is simple. Too much truth destabilizes, so truth must be managed. With Atlas, that instinct multiplies. Every anomaly is buried under jargon. Every unexplained detail is reframed as inconclusive. The truth is split into fragments, distributed so that no single person has the full picture. But secrecy is fragile. It depends on obedience from those tasked with maintaining it. Scientists whisper, engineers leak, amateurs with telescopes spot things officials hoped would remain hidden. The psychology of control requires secrecy, but Atlas ensures secrecy cannot last. Religion adds another dimension. Faith has always been a mechanism of control, shaping behaviour by framing existence within divine order. Atlas destabilises that mechanism as well. If another intelligence is revealed to be shaping Mars, many believers will see their doctrines collapse. Others will interpret Atlas as confirmation of prophecy. Both reactions fracture religious institutions. Leaders lose their authority when congregations split. A fractured faith landscape intensifies unrest. The very structures meant to stabilise society under pressure begin to amplify chaos. Control evaporates not only from governments, but from the spiritual anchors people turn to in crisis. Control also depends on time. Leaders manage populations by assuring them that problems are temporary, that recovery will come if people remain patient. Atlas denies that comfort. The timescale is too vast, the transformation too permanent. When Mars begins to change, no leader can say it will return to normal. No policy can promise restoration. The loss is not temporary, it is epochal. And in that realization, the psychology of control falters. People who understand the permanence of the change stop listening to promises. They seek new anchors, new explanations, new leaders, and often in such moments they turn to extremism, to radical ideologies that promise certainty in the face of uncertainty. Control is lost to those who wield it best, not through reason, but through manipulation of fear. This erosion is not limited to governments and religions. Corporations wield their own forms of control through employment, consumption, and dependency. They tell consumers that life will continue as usual, that technology will provide solutions, that markets will adapt. But Atlas shatters that illusion as well. How do you sell a future when another intelligence is visibly rewriting it? How do you project profits when entire industries tied to Mars collapse? How do you promise innovation when Atlas demonstrates technologies that dwarf human capacity? Corporations survive on confidence as much as governments. Without it, they too lose control. And then there is the personal level. The psychology of control is not abstract. It is intimate. Each individual sustains themselves by believing they have some agency in their lives, that their choices matter, that their actions shape outcomes. Atlas undermines that directly. When people grasp that the fate of entire planets is being decided by forces they cannot influence, their sense of agency collapses. Depression rises, motivation falters, productivity declines. The collapse of control becomes not just systemic but personal, spreading silently through households, workplaces, communities. People disengage from the future because they know the future is not theirs. But there is another dimension to this psychology, one even more insidious. Control is not just about maintaining order, it is about conditioning. Populations are trained to accept hierarchies, to follow instructions, to believe that obedience ensures safety. Atlas threatens that conditioning because it reveals that the hierarchy stops somewhere beyond humanity. That realization produces two extreme reactions, despair or defiance. Some will collapse into hopelessness, believing humanity has no role to play. Others will rebel, not just against governments, but against the cosmic order itself. Both reactions destabilize societies, making control impossible. What leaders fear most is not panic in the streets, but the slow erosion of obedience. People stop paying taxes, soldiers stop following orders, workers stop producing. The machine of civilization depends on billions of small acts of compliance. Without them, no government can function. Atlas is the perfect solvent for compliance. It dissolves the belief that obedience matters, that structures of authority are meaningful. that leaders can protect. When those beliefs dissolve, control collapses without a single shot fired. This collapse of control is why silence is enforced so brutally. Leaders understand that once the illusion is broken, it cannot be restored. You cannot convince populations to trust again once they know the truth was withheld. You cannot rebuild authority once people see that you were powerless all along. So the psychology of control dictates silence as the only option. Delay the collapse for as long as possible, even if it means magnifying the disaster when the truth arrives. That is the calculation. And it is a calculation made not out of ignorance but out of fear. Atlas, however, makes delay impossible. When its gases begin to reshape Mars's atmosphere, the evidence will be undeniable. Amateur astronomers will record changes, data will leak, images will spread. No amount of secrecy will preserve the illusion then. Control will collapse in real time, and the institutions that depended on it will crumble with it. That collapse will not be sudden chaos, but a slow grinding erosion. Each week, another anomaly. Each month, another revelation. Each year, another layer of trust gone. Until at last the world wakes to find that no one believes in control anymore, and the structures built on that belief are dust. The psychology of control was always fragile. It depended on stories, illusions, and silence. Atlas tears through them all, and when it does, humanity will face not just the loss of Mars, but the loss of something deeper. The belief that anyone, anywhere is in charge. That belief is the cornerstone of civilization. Without it, everything we built begins to unravel. The most effective forms of control are not imposed in the moment. They are cultivated across generations. Conditioning works not by brute force but by repetition, by weaving patterns into culture so deeply that they are mistaken for common sense. When people inherit these patterns, they no longer question them. They do not see them as instructions. They see them as the natural order of things. That is the secret of conditioning through history. And when you look carefully, you begin to see it everywhere. Myths, rituals, institutions, even scientific frameworks. Many of them operate less as spontaneous human inventions and more as scaffolding. Scaffolding designed to prepare populations for something they were not told about directly. Something like Atlas. Consider the oldest stories of the sky. Civilizations scattered across the globe, separated by oceans and centuries, tell remarkably similar tales of visitors from above. Fiery chariots, winged beings, luminous orbs descending to teach or to punish. At first glance, these are cultural coincidences, the shared human impulse to project imagination onto the heavens. But the details often align too precisely. Many myths describe cycles, returns, patterns of appearances timed with celestial events. Why would unrelated cultures emphasize return rather than one-time miracles? Because they were being conditioned to expect repetition, to normalize the idea that visitors come back, that celestial intrusions are not unique. That expectation seeps into generations until it feels natural. Conditioning through myth ensures that when the real cycles resume, people accept them as part of a story already familiar. Rituals reinforce this conditioning. Festivals tied to solstices, sacrifices linked to eclipses, prayers offered when comets appeared. These were not random religious expressions. They were systems of rehearsal. Communities practiced how to respond to celestial events, gather, prepare, sacrifice, obey. Over centuries, these behaviors became instinctive. The sky changes, the people respond with ritual. That is conditioning at scale. The surface meaning may fade. The gods demand it, the ancestors command it, but the deeper function persists. Populations are trained to see celestial events as signals requiring coordinated behavior. When Atlas arrives, that conditioning still echoes. People may not sacrifice animals at temples, but they will gather around screens, obey official instructions, and submit to narratives that frame the event as something beyond their control. History's institutions serve the same purpose. Kingdoms rose claiming divine authority from the heavens. Emperors ruled by mandate of celestial order. Priests tracked the skies not for curiosity, but to sustain political power. The connection between rulers and the stars conditioned populations to accept that power comes from above, not below. If a king commanded obedience, it was because the heavens sanctioned it. This too was rehearsal, teaching people that when messages or interventions come from the sky, they carry authority that must not be questioned. Atlas therefore enters a cultural landscape already primed. Populations are conditioned to associate skyward phenomena with authority. Even if governments deny it, the reflex will remain. Something from the heavens carries weight beyond human law. Even science, the discipline meant to free us from superstition, has played its role in conditioning. Astronomy began as astrology, a system of omens. Over time it refined into mathematics, predictions and models. But the transition never erased the underlying lesson. People still believe that the sky dictates destiny. Horoscopes persist. Eclipses draw awe, and comets trigger unease even in secular minds. The language may be modern, the tools advanced, but the reflex remains. Centuries of scientific framing have conditioned us to believe the sky holds answers beyond the ground we walk on. And so, when Atlas delivers anomalies science cannot explain, the conditioned response is not skepticism, but fascination. Populations lean in, waiting for interpretation, ready to adjust behaviour according to what they're told. Education systems reinforce this conditioning in subtle ways. From childhood, students are taught stories of exploration, pioneers moving into frontiers, of humanity's inevitable march outward. Space programs are framed not just as science, but as destiny. Generations have been conditioned to believe that Mars is the next step, that expansion into space is natural and unavoidable. That belief ensures compliance with massive investments, obedience to policies, and patience for failures. It ensures that when the moment arrives, populations will accept colonization as not just possible but necessary. Atlas threatens this conditioning by revealing that Mars may not be ours to claim. But the groundwork remains. Populations are ready to respond to Mars as central, even if not in the way they were promised. Conditioning also works through fear. Catastrophe myths condition people to accept destruction as cyclical and survivable. Floods, plagues, fires. These stories prepare populations to endure disaster without collapsing entirely. The lesson is always the same. Catastrophe comes, catastrophe passes, life continues. That conditioning prevents panic from annihilating society when real disasters strike. In the case of Atlas, the fear conditioning primes people to accept planetary change as survivable, even if terrifying. They have already internalized the idea that civilizations rise and fall under cosmic cycles. Atlas simply confirms what they were taught to expect. Across history, conditioning often came disguised as art. Carvings of gods descending, paintings of fiery wheels, structures aligned to solstices, all function as more than aesthetic or spiritual objects. They are memory devices, conditioning future generations to connect the heavens with destiny. Even megaliths may serve this role. Stonehenge, pyramids, ziggurats. They are monuments not only to human ambition but to conditioning. By aligning with celestial cycles, they train populations to track the heavens, to see them as central to life. Millennia later, the reflex remains. We look to the sky for answers because we were conditioned to do so, not because it is inherently rational. This conditioning extends even into modern media. Films, books and television present alien arrivals, interstellar machines, and cosmic cycles not as shocking impossibilities, but as familiar stories. For decades, entertainment has conditioned us to accept that such scenarios are thinkable. When Atlas behaves like a machine, populations will not collapse into disbelief. They have been prepared by narrative conditioning. They will slip into the grooves of stories they already know, framing the event within archetypes they have absorbed since childhood. This conditioning softens the shock, ensuring that even the impossible feels strangely expected. But there is a darker edge to this historical conditioning. If it exists, then it may not be accidental. Myths, rituals, institutions, science, and media may all have been nudged, steered, or influenced by forces outside humanity. Perhaps the conditioning was not a human invention but a program, designed to prepare populations for contact or for subordination. If Atlas is part of a long cycle, then conditioning through history ensures that when it arrives, humanity reacts predictably. Not with rebellion, but with compliance. Not with defiance, but with submission. Conditioned populations do not question the program. They accept it as part of the order they were taught to believe in. This raises the unsettling possibility that even our sense of free will is shaped by conditioning. The choices we think we make independently may be guided by patterns seeded centuries earlier. Our willingness to explore space, our obsession with Mars, our fear of comets, all may be products of conditioning designed to steer us toward predictable behaviours. If so, then Atlas is not just a machine delivering gases to Mars. It is the culmination of a psychological program unfolding across millennia. Conditioning through history also explains why silence from agencies is effective. Populations have been trained to accept that not knowing is part of the story. Myths withheld secrets, religions kept mysteries, governments classified information. People expect to be denied the full truth, and they accept it as normal. That acceptance is itself conditioning. It ensures that when Atlas is concealed behind jargon, people shrug instead of revolt. They have been taught through history that truth is always hidden, always partial, always reserved for the powerful. That resignation is the ultimate product of conditioning, and yet conditioning is never perfect. Some resist, some break free. Throughout history, prophets, rebels, and visionaries have emerged who challenged the conditioning, who warned that the patterns were manipulation. Often, they were silenced, ridiculed, or destroyed. But their warnings persist in fragments, preserved in texts and traditions that hint at the larger program. Perhaps those fragments are the only unconditioned voices humanity has ever had, and perhaps Atlas will vindicate them, revealing that their madness was sanity all along. When you step back, the picture is stark. Humanity has been conditioned for millennia to accept celestial interventions, to connect the heavens with authority, to obey cycles of destruction and renewal, to trust that the future is shaped from above. That conditioning has carried through myths, rituals, institutions, science, and media until it feels like common sense. And now, as Atlas approaches Mars, that conditioning is about to be tested. Populations will respond not freely, but according to the patterns drilled into them across centuries. They will comply because they were taught to comply. They will accept because they were taught to accept. Conditioning through history ensures that the program unfolds smoothly. Whether humanity benefits or not, whether it thrives or collapses, its reactions will not be spontaneous. They will be the product of a design far older than Atlas itself. There is always a human tendency to imagine vast operations as chaotic. Clumsy bureaucracies, competing agencies, miscommunications that tangle progress into failure. But the biggest, most effective programs seldom look like that. They look instead like networks, quiet webs of coordination that stitch together disparate actors into a single functioning organism. If Atlas is part of a program, then it is hardly surprising that the infrastructure supporting it would be hidden, deep, and meticulously organized. This is not a conspiracy of men in a basement. It is an architecture, a distributed system of control and information designed to endure, to adapt, and to move quietly, while the rest of the world interprets the noise as randomness. Think first of how any long-term project is actually managed. It requires sensors, eyes and ears that gather the raw signals. It requires analysts to interpret those signals into meaning. It requires decision nodes that can convert meaning into action. And critically, it requires distribution, the ability to propagate commands and receive feedback across time and distance. The hidden coordination network that would oversee something like Atlas would include all of these layers, but in forms far subtler than a single agency or an obvious command center. It would be distributed across institutions, cloaked in legitimate activity, and buffered from the messy turbulence of public life by 1,000 ordinary-looking interactions. That distribution is both practical and strategic. Practical because a centralized command visible to the world is easy to disrupt. Any actor sufficiently motivated could target it, leaking data, impeding operations, or sabotaging infrastructure. Strategic because diffuse networks are resilient. You can lose nodes, reroute traffic, or mask true intent behind innocuous tasks. Imagine a layer of international scientific collaborations, each formal and public, astronomy consortia, interagency data sharing agreements, multinational research partnerships. On paper, they exist to advance knowledge. In practice, they double as covert sensor grids and information routes. Telescopes in Chile, radio arrays in Australia, spectrometers in space. Each gathers legitimate data while simultaneously feeding a hidden stream of processed signals into the network. The public sees publications. The network sees patterns. Next, consider the role of private companies. In our era, so much of the infrastructure formerly reserved for governments is managed by corporate entities. Launch services, satellite constellations, sensor platforms, data analytics. Private firms now provide capabilities that would have needed state resources only decades ago. That creates an efficient front for a hidden network. Contracts, partnerships, and procurement processes can be used to legalize access. A commercial imaging service books a client to monitor a mining claim in Siberia. In the next moment, that same service is tasking its arrays to monitor faint spectral lines on a comet. The transactions look routine in accounting books. In reality, they provide the network the cover and bandwidth it needs. There is also a human dimension embedded into the network that deserves attention: the culture of compartmentalization. Large projects that must stay secret rarely allocate full context to every participant. Engineers, scientists, and administrators learn only what their tasks require. That reduces the probability of leaks and creates plausible deniability. Within such a network, a cryogenic systems team builds valves. They're unaware of the planet the valves are ultimately meant to affect. A communications division manages encryption keys without knowing which observatory will use them to observe Atlas. This discipline of partial knowledge is what allows massive, delicate operations to proceed without becoming a public spectacle. It is not sleight of hand. It is an institutional design principle. Financial flows are a third critical component. Look beyond obvious budgets and imagine layered financing. Legitimate grants for astrophysics that mask special allocations, private foundations channeling funds into shell projects, and classified budgets routed through defense or intelligence accounts. Money moves in legal envelopes, and each envelope bears a pretext plausible enough to withstand scrutiny. That financial opacity is the grease that keeps the network's gears turning. When you combine public grant money, corporate R&D funding, and a few well-placed classified lines, you create a financial architecture that can underwrite the maintenance of objects like Atlas across centuries. That's how a program survives, not by dramatic spending in one fiscal year, but by a steady, diffuse flow that avoids the glare of auditors and watchdogs. The network's information architecture matters too. Think of it like an emergency services dispatch system, but global and temporal. Alerts are not shouted from an obvious podium. They are routed through layers of trusted intermediaries who transform raw observation into action. A faint spectral anomaly is logged by an observatory in Greece. The data packet is forwarded to a regional analysis node, where algorithms and human analysts combine to evaluate significance. If a threshold is crossed, the packet is re-encrypted and forwarded through a tier of coordinators, institutions that know how to coordinate rapid response without exposing the upstream sensors. The data lineage is deliberately complex so that any external investigator sees only a chain of legitimate collaborations rather than a covert command pipeline. Complexity is camouflage. Legal systems and diplomatic channels become part of the network as well. Treaties, memoranda of understanding, bilateral research agreements all provide plausible reasons for cross-border data flow that would otherwise be suspicious. They are tools that blend clandestine command and compliance with the texture of normal international relations. Consider how easily an intelligence sharing accord can be repurposed. A clause meant to coordinate space debris monitoring becomes, under a different interpretation, a mechanism to distribute Atlas observations to a select group. In a world of international law, the network hides in plain sight by nesting its operations within frameworks designed for legitimate cooperation. Another element is the human cognition of interpretation. Networks do not merely move bits, they shape narratives. A coordinated network has the capability to prime scientific and public discourse. Papers, conferences, and curated press releases can be timed to create a preferred interpretation. If Atlas behaves oddly, the network can funnel preliminary interpretations, carefully worded, hedged, and skeptical, through trusted journals and influential commentators. The public hears a chorus of doubt, and the extreme explanations fail to gain traction. This is not necessarily malicious manipulation in intent, it is governance by narrative. Control over interpretation buys the network time to act, while public opinion remains complacent or misdirected. The people who populate these networks matter, and their psychology is remarkable in its conformity. They are not caricatures of conspirators, they are professionals, astronomers, engineers, grant managers, corporate procurement officers who share the mundane motivations of careers, pensions, and reputations. When recruited into the network, they adopt its culture through socialization rather than coercion. They learn to value the mission, to accept the compartmentalized truths, and to trust the processes that keep sensitive operations on schedule. Loyalty grows, not from blind faith, but from the pragmatic benefits of employment, prestige, and the quiet nobility of being entrusted with secrets that seem too fragile for mass consumption. Resilience is another defining trait. The network's architecture anticipates failure. Nodes are redundant. Data is mirrored across jurisdictions. Where one observatory goes offline due to political pressure, another under a different flag picks up the slack. Where one company's servers are compromised, the network automatically reroutes to alternate service providers. This redundancy is not accidental. It is deliberate engineering to ensure longevity. Programs designed to operate across centuries must be resilient to political shifts, economic downturns, and technological change. That explains why the network is embedded across both public and private sectors, across many nations and across different technological strata. Technology itself plays a subtle but decisive role. Modern cryptography, distributed ledgers, and secure multi-party computation allow organizations to collaborate on shared problems without exposing data. The network can perform joint analyses while ensuring no single participant holds all the data. This reduces the risk of leaks while enabling coordinated action. Imagine a distributed telescope array where final synthesis, combining thousands of observations into a coherent model, is performed in an encrypted, decentralized environment. No single person sees the whole picture until the network's thresholds for disclosure are met. That is how secrecy is preserved, through the very tools we build to ensure security. The historical depth of the network matters too. Such coordination did not spring into being overnight. Its roots likely extend back decades, perhaps back to the first cautious observations of Oumuamua and its oddities. In those early moments, actors with enough foresight and curiosity detected patterns that appeared insignificant to others. They began to establish protocols, how to log anomalies, whom to notify, how to fund follow-up observations without alarming the public. Over time, these protocols hardened into institutions, norms developed, habits codified. What looked at first like ad hoc secrecy became a bureaucratic reality, a standing hidden bureaucracy built around the management of anomalous celestial phenomena. The network also has a moral economy of its own. Its operators often justify secrecy on the grounds of preventing panic or preserving stability. They tell themselves they are stewards, managing a fragile truth for the greater good. That moral framing is compelling because it resonates with professional ethics. Do no harm, prevent unnecessary alarm. But it creates a dangerous paradox. The same secrecy designed to preserve order also breeds a kind of hubris, the belief that a small circle can determine what the many may safely know. When the moral economy of stewardship outweighs democratic accountability, the network becomes an oligarchy of interpretation. Decisions are made in corridors rather than in publics, and the consequences ripple outward long before anyone elected a representative to weigh in. Operationally, the network resembles a staged production. There are rehearsals and dry runs, contingency plans for different scenarios, and protocols for staged disclosure. Scripts exist for public briefings that will be delivered if certain thresholds are met. Those scripts are prepared not with the transparency of a democratic press office, but with the caution of crisis management teams who have rehearsed the exact words that minimize panic while preserving control. The people who write those scripts are not necessarily malicious, they are risk managers, yet their scripts shape what a society can know and when, conferring enormous power on a small cadre of writers and decision makers. There are also feedback channels designed to manage surprise. If an amateur astronomer posts a convincing series of photographs showing Atlas's behaviour is more anomalous than official statements claim, the network has methods to engage that community without igniting public frenzy. Outreach teams reach out quietly, offering access to curated data, inviting select amateurs into controlled forums, or offering grants to credible researchers under non-disclosure. This approach co-opts potential whistleblowers, turning them into controlled contributors. It is soft power, seduction instead of suppression, used to manage the edges of public awareness. Finally, there is the strategic calculus embedded in the network's very existence. The network's operators know something often forgotten by publics. Timing matters more than truth in many scenarios. Revealing too much too soon can destroy an institution's ability to respond. Revealing nothing too late can destroy public trust forever. Their challenge is to thread that needle, to orchestrate disclosures when the world is prepared enough to absorb them, and to hold secrecy when premature revelation would do more harm than good. That calculus is political and moral, not purely technical. It assumes a judgment about what the world can handle, and that assumption is the network's most consequential decision. When you put all of this together, the distributed sensors, the corporate integration, the financial opacity, the compartmentalized workforce, the legal scaffolding, the technological cryptography, the staged disclosure strategies, you end up with a hidden coordination network that is as ordinary as it is extraordinary. It is ordinary because it relies on mundane institutions doing what they always do: write grants, process contracts, publish papers. It is extraordinary because woven together those mundane acts produce the capacity to manage phenomena that would otherwise be unmanageable, and that is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the matter. A program as patient as Atlas requires not dramatic villainy but disciplined administration. It requires networks that outlast regimes, budgets that survive crises, and cultures that accept secrecy as stewardship. Hidden coordination networks are not the stuff of fantasy. They are the inevitable infrastructure of any long-term planetary project. If Atlas is part of such a project, then what we are witnessing is the face of a modern administrative miracle. a web of institutions capable of acting on timescales far longer than those of any single human life. None of this excuses deception if it is used to hide harms. None of it softens the ethical questions about who decides and who is excluded. The network's existence forces us to confront difficult questions about accountability, consent, and the limits of secrecy in an age when information leaks can become existential. It forces us to ask whether a handful of institutions, operating in distributed silence, should hold the keys to decisions that reshape worlds. The presence of the network does not answer those questions. It only makes them unavoidable. If Atlas completes its passage and Mars changes, the network will have succeeded in its immediate goal. But success will not resolve the deeper dilemma. A civilization's fate should not be decided by hidden architectures alone. The existence of a hidden coordination network capable of shepherding cosmic engineering puts power beyond public oversight. It solves certain technical problems brilliantly, but it creates political and moral problems of equal magnitude. When the dust settles, the most consequential debate may not be about the chemistry in Mars's atmosphere. It may be about whether humanity will accept that an invisible administrative web guided the change, who built that web, and whether any society should allow such a network to act again without consent. Human beings tend to think of history as a straight line, a march from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge, from caves to cities to rockets and beyond. But if you step back, if you look at the archaeological record, the myths, the inexplicable ruins, and the sudden disappearances of entire cultures, a different picture begins to form. History is not a line, it is a loop. Civilizations rise, flourish, collapse, and reset, only to rise again, and the timing of these cycles often aligns disturbingly well with celestial events. Comets, climate shifts, sudden atmospheric changes, unexplained anomalies in the sky. The possibility emerges that these cycles are not random at all, but orchestrated. That humanity itself may be trapped in a program of rise and reset, just as Atlas now threatens to reset the balance of Mars. Consider the sudden collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE. In less than a century, nearly every major power of the Eastern Mediterranean fell. Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, all collapsed under a storm of invasions, famine, and social unrest. Historians cite earthquakes, droughts, and foreign raiders, but the simultaneity is suspicious. Multiple unrelated societies collapsing at once points not to chance but to synchronization. And synchronization implies a trigger. What if that trigger was celestial? Records from that period speak of fiery phenomena in the sky, of gods wielding flaming weapons, of days turned strange. If those were references to cometary activity or interventions from bodies like Atlas, then the Bronze Age collapse was not simply historical accident, but a programmed reset. Move forward to the fall of Rome. 1,000 years of empire reduced to fragments. Plagues, invasions, economic breakdown. The official explanations are many. But again, records describe anomalies in the sky. Strange lights, comets heralding doom. The Antonine Plague, which devastated Rome in the 2nd century, arrived in a wave coinciding with celestial events. Was it coincidence, or another reset timed to dismantle a system that had reached its threshold? The timing is what unsettles. Civilizations flourish just long enough to stabilize, to expand, to claim dominance, and then a trigger arrives, disease, invasion, catastrophe that shatters the order. The cycle begins again, leaving ruins for future generations to puzzle over. Even more unsettling are the anomalies that predate recorded history. Göbekli Tepe, a monumental site in Turkey, dates back 12,000 years, far earlier than agriculture was supposed to exist. Its megaliths are aligned with celestial patterns, carved with animals and symbols that appear to record astronomical cycles. Why would a pre-agricultural society build such a complex observatory? Because they were tracking something. Perhaps they were preparing for the return of an object, a reset they had been warned about or already endured. If so, then our linear model of progress is an illusion. Humanity may have risen before, reached technological peaks we cannot imagine, and then been reset by cosmic events timed to erase and restart. Atlas may be the latest in a long sequence of instruments that enforce this rhythm. Think about how myths encode memory. Nearly every culture preserves flood stories, catastrophic deluges wiping out nearly all life, leaving only a handful of survivors to begin again. These stories are dismissed as allegories of local river floods, but the global consistency defies coincidence. It is as if humanity collectively remembers a reset event, a time when the cycle turned and civilization was forced back to zero. Some describe fire instead of water, some describe famine, ice, or plague. The theme is the same: destruction followed by renewal, erasure followed by rebuilding. The cycle of rise and reset embedded in myth is too persistent to ignore. It feels like a warning coded into culture so future generations would recognize the pattern when it returned. Now overlay this framework onto Mars. The rovers have already revealed evidence of past habitability: rivers, lakes, even seas. A world that once could have supported life now lies barren. What if Mars itself endured the cycle? It rose into habitability, perhaps even into flourishing life, and then it was reset. Atmosphere stripped, water frozen or lost, the biosphere erased. Now Atlas returns, venting gases, delivering organics, restarting the process. Mars may not be a lifeless planet at all. It may be a reset planet, caught in the same cycle that grips Earth, only on a different phase of the timetable. That is why the patterns in Sumerian texts, Mayan calendars, and other ancient records matter. They may not describe only Earth. They may describe a system-wide cycle, with planets alternately rising and resetting under the influence of visitors like Atlas. The psychological impact of recognizing this cycle is profound. Humans pride themselves on progress, on the sense that each generation builds higher than the last. But if history is cyclical, then our so-called progress is simply repetition. We climb, we peak, we collapse, and then we climb again. Each iteration leaves traces, ruins, myths, artifacts that confuse us because we insist on linearity. But the ruins are markers of earlier peaks. The myths are memories of earlier resets. And Atlas, drifting toward Mars, is a reminder that the cycle may not be purely internal. It may be enforced from outside, triggered by celestial interventions that reset civilizations before they climb too high. This interpretation also explains the paradox of lost knowledge. Ancient texts describe technologies, architectures, and sciences that seem impossible for their time. They speak of flying machines, of weapons of fire, of knowledge of the stars so advanced it defies explanation. Mainstream historians dismiss these as exaggerations. But if earlier civilizations truly rose high before being reset, then these fragments are not exaggerations but memories. Memories of technologies lost in the resets, echoes of earlier peaks erased deliberately to ensure the cycle repeats. Atlas could be one of the enforcers of that erasure, stripping planets of habitability to wipe clean the slate, forcing life and civilization to start again from scratch. Look at the geological record for further clues. Ice cores preserve evidence of sudden climate shifts, abrupt temperature swings that cannot be explained by slow natural variation alone. These shifts often coincide with cultural collapses, extinctions, and migrations. Each shift acts as a reset button, compressing populations, reducing complexity, forcing survivors into simpler forms of existence. The coincidence between geological resets and cultural resets is too strong to ignore. And when celestial anomalies line up with those shifts, the case becomes stronger still. Cycles of rise and reset may be not just cultural but planetary, imposed by a timetable written in the heavens. Why would such a cycle exist? That is the haunting question. If resets are natural, driven by cosmic mechanics, cometary cycles, orbital resonances, stellar variability, then we are simply caught in a brutal system indifferent to our survival. But if resets are engineered, triggered deliberately by intelligences using objects like Atlas, then the picture changes. Civilization itself becomes a managed process, allowed to rise only so far before being pruned back, guided like a garden rather than left to grow wild. That possibility reframes all of history. Humanity is not climbing a mountain. It is walking on a treadmill, overseen by forces that determine how far we are allowed to advance before the reset comes. Some evidence suggests these resets are not total but selective. Certain knowledge survives across cycles, passed through myths, encoded in symbols, preserved in sacred sites. Perhaps the resets are not meant to annihilate, but to regulate. Allowing civilizations to rise too high too fast may threaten balances we cannot perceive. Resets preserve the system, not by extermination, but by pruning. Mars's current transformation may represent the planting stage after a long pruning, the start of a new rise in the cycle. Earth may not be far behind. Our collapse, when it comes, may be the necessary counterpart to Mars's renewal. Two planets linked in alternating cycles of rise and reset, like pistons in an engine. This cyclical view of history is difficult to accept because it undermines human pride. It means our achievements are not unique, not unprecedented, not permanent. It means that others before us may have built cities as advanced as ours, only to see them erased. It means that our future is not open-ended but constrained, bounded by cycles that we cannot escape. And it means that Atlas is not simply a comet. It is a clock hand ticking forward to the next reset. But perhaps awareness is itself a break in the cycle. If civilizations before us were conditioned to forget, to accept collapse as divine punishment or random catastrophe, then remembering the pattern may be the first step toward escaping it. Recognizing Atlas as part of the reset mechanism could change how humanity reacts. Instead of collapsing into chaos, we might resist, adapt, and preserve knowledge across the transition. Maybe the cycle cannot be stopped, but it can be endured differently. Maybe this time, the reset will not erase us completely. And that possibility, that fragile, dangerous hope, is what makes the cycles of rise and reset so important to understand. Because if Atlas is indeed the herald of another reset, then we are standing on the threshold of our own cycle's end. Whether we collapse like those before us or find a way to carry our knowledge through depends on whether we see the pattern for what it is. The sky is not random. The resets are not chance. They are rhythm. And Mars, once again awakening under the touch of Atlas, is proof that the rhythm is real. From the moment a civilization can look outward, it faces a question it cannot avoid. What will it do when the universe looks back? The competency exam for humanity is not a test administered by a single examiner with a clipboard. It is a set of pressures, constraints, and choices that reveal whether a species is ready to join the wider engineering of worlds or whether it remains bound to tribal instincts. Atlas, arriving at Mars with chemistry, timing, and trajectory that hint at deliberate design, exposes that exam in brutal clarity. We must answer whether we act like a species capable of stewardship, cooperation, and restraint, or whether we react like fragmented tribes lashing out at a mystery we cannot control. Competency is not simply technological skill. It is not measured purely by the massive rockets we can loft, the energy budgets we can spend, or the sensors we can build. Those are necessary conditions, but not sufficient. The deeper aspects of competency touch governance, ethics, long-term thinking, and the social capacities to manage knowledge responsibly. A species that can point a telescope and detect an anomaly, but cannot coordinate an honest public response, fails the test in crucial ways. Atlas forces us to examine all of those dimensions, because if it is indeed part of a program running on timescales beyond our politics, then the way we respond matters as much as the comet's chemistry. The first part of the exam is transparency versus secrecy. A competent species builds institutions that can handle extraordinary information without collapsing into panic or authoritarian reflexes. It creates channels for meaningful debate, for expert analysis that is accountable to publics, and for decisions that balance risk with democratic legitimacy. The instinct to hide, to manage interpretation behind closed doors, to let elites decide without consent, is the instinct of immaturity. It privileges preservation of power over the common good. When Atlas began its anomalous behaviour, the default reaction of powerful actors was secrecy, classify the data, restrict publication, and control the narrative. That instinct tells us something important. Our institutions are not yet practiced in managing existential anomalies as public goods. We flunk the first question if we cannot find ways to responsibly inform and involve the people who will live with the consequences. The second part of the exam is cooperation at scale. Competent species demonstrate the ability to pool resources, share data honestly, and resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. In the face of Atlas, the ideal response would be multinational scientific coalitions, transparent sharing of spectra, orbital mechanics and modelling, joint contingency planning that includes both technical and ethical considerations, and a global dialogue about options and trade-offs. Instead, what we see is fragmentation, agencies hedging, corporations protecting proprietary data, nations jockeying for advantage. That fragmentation does not only slow scientific progress, it heightens the risk of miscalculation. When information is siloed, decisions get made on incomplete pictures. Competence requires that we learn to move beyond that reflex, toward binding agreements, toward data commons, toward inclusive deliberation that recognizes the stakes exceed national interests. If Atlas exposes our incapacity to cooperate, we fail this part of the exam in a way that could cost lives and futures. The third component is ethical imagination. To be competent is to be able to think beyond narrow self-interest and to imagine the rights of entities not yet here, planetary ecosystems that might be nascent, microbial life we have not yet found, and the moral standing of worlds that could be reshaped. Terraforming is not a purely technical operation. It is a moral act with consequences that ripple across millennia. The question is not only whether we can make Mars habitable, but whether we should, and who decides. If an external intelligence has already decided, the ethical burden shifts to us. How do we respond? Do we accept, resist, negotiate? Competent behaviour would create forums to wrestle with these questions openly, to stipulate principles for planetary stewardship, to weigh the rights of nascent ecosystems against human aspirations. If we cannot imagine those obligations, we're technically advanced but morally adolescent. That failure would be visible in the flippant way some leaders talk about Mars as real estate, or resources, ignoring the deep ethical questions Atlas forces into the open. The fourth item on the exam is temporal thinking. Civilizations that pass the test plan on timescales beyond election cycles and quarterly profits. They build institutions and legal frameworks designed to operate and adapt over centuries. That is not simple patience. It is a culture of fiduciary responsibility toward future generations. Atlas is a reminder that the relevant timescales for cosmic engineering dwarf the rhythms of human politics. If we respond with short-termism, secret deals to buy advantage, rushed missions that skip safety protocols, profiteering rather than careful stewardship, we fail the temporal component of competency. Competence would look like durable treaties, transparent oversight mechanisms, and mechanisms to preserve knowledge across potential resets, so that even if disruptions come, the cumulative wisdom of our species is not wiped away. Fifth, the exam probes our capacity for humility. Technological prowess without humility is dangerous. History offers many examples of hubris. species or civilizations that assumed mastery only to discover limits or unintended consequences, competent actors recognize that their models are imperfect, that interventions carry unknown risks, and that restraint is sometimes the wisest course. Atlas tests our humility in a concrete way. Do we assume we can intercept, control, or redirect it without understanding the full system? Or do we accept the limits of our current capability and seek to learn first, to prepare ethically and technically before acting? The reflex to do something quickly, to assert agency through force or haste, is the reflex of incompetence. Competency would show up as calculated restraint, paired with investment in long-term, transparent research. The sixth criterion is resilience. Competence includes the ability to absorb shocks, to preserve core functions of society, and to maintain the capacity for recovery. Atlas threatens to shatter narratives and confidence. A resilient society is one that has distributed redundancy, robust supply chains, strong local governance, social safety nets, and cultural practices that preserve knowledge through turmoil. If the revelation about Atlas causes markets to wobble, if it fractures trust in institutions, does our society have the social capital to withstand the fallout? Or do we quickly spiral into economic and political collapse, unable to preserve what matters? Competency is judged by how well a civilization can keep its institutions functional under stress, and the Atlas moment exposes how fragile our global systems may be. Another subtle part of the exam is our capacity for epistemic humility, the willingness to revise our beliefs in light of new evidence. Atlas challenges many core assumptions, from the uniqueness of human agency in planetary engineering to the completeness of our temporal narratives. Passing the test requires cognitive flexibility. Can we update our frameworks without descending into denial or conspiracy culture? Can we build public institutions that teach critical thinking and epistemic rigor, so populations do not fragment into rival epistemic tribes, each convinced of its own truth? Societies that fail this part of the exam find themselves paralyzed by competing narratives, unable to act because consensus evaporates into factionalism. Atlas will fragment discourse unless we cultivate shared epistemic practices that value transparency, reproducibility, and honest uncertainty. An often overlooked dimension is cultural maturity. The stories a civilization tells itself about meaning, destiny, and identity. Competency demands narratives that can absorb the revelation of non-human agency without collapsing into nihilism. That is not trivial. Many cultures anchor identity in myths of exceptionalism. Confronted with evidence that other intelligences, or even machines launched by them, are reshaping nearby worlds, those myths may rupture. Competent responses include cultural institutions, religious, artistic, educational, that can reinterpret identity to include humility, cooperation, and stewardship. A species whose cultural repertoire lacks the flexibility to reframe its place in the cosmos will fail the exam by fracturing internally, turning inward into suspicion and hostility. The exam also measures legal imagination. Current legal frameworks for space are woefully inadequate for the questions Atlas raises. The Outer Space Treaty, helpful as it was in preventing outright national annexation, was not written for scenarios involving autonomous terraforming devices crossing interstellar distances. Competency would look like a rapid mobilization of legal thinkers, diplomats, ethicists, and scientists to create binding frameworks that address planetary transformation, the rights of emergent ecosystems, and the governance of autonomous artifacts. It would look like transparent negotiations, global buy-in, and enforceable mechanisms. If instead space governance remains a patchwork of national laws, corporate contracts, and proprietary claims, we fail this part of the exam in ways that will become painfully obvious as Mars changes. Another measure of competency is our ability to protect and preserve knowledge. If cycles of rise and reset truly exist, One test of maturity is whether a civilization builds cultural and technological safekeeping mechanisms robust to catastrophic disruption. That includes distributed archives, redundancy of critical knowledge across different communities, and protocols for maintaining scientific literacy through upheaval. Atlas's passage could be followed by upheaval that erases certain capacities unless we intentionally preserve them. Competence would mean we have already built those safeguards, digital and analog, local and distributed, so that the thread of human knowledge remains unbroken even under reset conditions. Failure to plan for preservation is a moral shortfall in the exam. Then there is adaptability in governance structures. Competent societies can scale decision-making up and down based on the problem. They can convene emergency assemblies, juries of experts, and citizen bodies that deliberate under crisis with legitimacy. They can balance authority with oversight so decisions are both agile and accountable. Atlas tests that ability. If our governance is rigid, unable to convene inclusive, legitimate forums quickly, decisions will be made by a narrow circle and will lack public trust. Competence is shown when systems adapt procedurally, allowing for rapid, transparent, and inclusive responses to extraordinary events. The exam also looks at inequality. Societies marked by deep inequality often fail existential tests, because unequal institutions lack the cohesion necessary for collective action. If responses to Atlas are framed by elites and serve their interests, the broader society will feel betrayed and may resist cooperation. Competence requires policies that share risks and benefits equitably, and that avoid privileging narrow interests in decisions that affect all. If our response to Atlas becomes a scramble by rich nations and corporations to monopolize Mars, we fail the exam on grounds of justice and fairness. Competency includes distributive justice as a core element of survival. Perhaps the most existential part of the exam is imagination. Do we have the capacity to envision futures beyond immediate gain? Competency entails the cultivation of art, philosophy, and speculative thought that can host long-term thinking. It is easy to compute trajectories in chemistry, harder to imagine legal regimes centuries from now, modes of stewardship that persist, or ethical obligations owed to worlds we will never see. A civilization that narrows its imagination to market outcomes and short-term power will fail to create the moral frameworks needed for planetary-scale decisions. Atlas demands imaginative depth. Those who cannot provide it fail the exam. Finally, the exam probes courage, the willingness to choose restraint over impulsive action, to accept limits when necessary, and to risk political cost for the sake of long-term survival. Competency is not comfortable. It asks leaders to be unpopular if necessary, to bind themselves to treaties that cost votes in the short term, but preserve civilization's future. Atlas will reveal whether our leaders possess that courage. If they squander it for immediate advantage, they fail the exam and condemn their societies to avoidable catastrophe or moral compromise. Taken together, these criteria form a rigorous test. Atlas may be the proximate trigger, but the exam has been ongoing for generations. Our institutions have been graded daily by how they manage climate, pandemics, and technological change. Atlas simply raises the stakes to cosmic scale. Passing the competency exam for humanity means building institutions that are transparent, cooperative, ethically imaginative, temporally extended, humble, resilient, epistemically rigorous, culturally adaptable, legally inventive, equitable, imaginative, and courageous. None of this is to suggest the test is binary or immediate. Competence is a spectrum, and civilizations can evolve. Awareness of the exam is itself a chance to improve. The very fact that we can articulate the criteria gives us an opportunity to change. Atlas is not merely a threat. It is a mirror that reveals our strengths and weaknesses. It gives us the chance to reform institutions, to build legal frameworks, to cultivate humility and cooperation, and to preserve knowledge across disruptions. That possibility is the narrow pathway to passing the exam. If we fail, the consequences are not merely tragic, they are instructive. Species that fail competency tests tend to fragment, to be outmaneuvered by more coordinated actors, and often to be pushed into subordinate roles. If Atlas represents a program run by actors with a longer temporal horizon, then failing the exam could mean being permanently sidelined from decisions about nearby worlds. We might be left to scavenge second-order benefits under rules designed by others. That outcome would be humiliating but survivable if we learn from it. If we pass, we retain dignity, agency, and the possibility of meaningful partnership in the future, engineering of systems beyond our planet. The choice, in other words, becomes existential and ethical at once. Atlas tests whether we are ready to be responsible actors in a cosmos where other intelligences, agendas, and architectures exist. It is less about whether we can fire rockets, and more about whether we can govern with wisdom. The competency exam for humanity is underway. Our responses today decide not just where we stand tomorrow, but whether we earn a place at the table when the next set of decisions about planets, biospheres, and the future of life are made. Every story eventually narrows to a decision point. No matter how complex the build-up, no matter how layered the evidence, no matter how tangled the webs of secrecy and conditioning, the threads converge toward a single dilemma. Atlas has forced that convergence. Its passage by Mars is not simply a scientific anomaly or a geopolitical irritant. It is a mirror reflecting back the deepest truth about humanity's position in the cosmos. And that truth, stripped of distractions, boils down to a binary choice. Will we submit to the role designed for us, accepting subordination in a hierarchy we did not choose? Or will we attempt to transcend, breaking free of the cycles and the conditioning, seizing agency even when the odds seem impossibly stacked against us? That is the final choice. Subordination offers comfort of a sort. It is the easier path because it requires little imagination, little risk. To subordinate ourselves means accepting the program as it exists. It means treating Atlas not as an intrusion, but as a caretaker, not as a threat, but as a guide. It means interpreting the cycles of rise and reset as part of a natural order we cannot change. Civilizations before us may have taken this path, accepting collapse as fate, rebuilding when allowed, surrendering to the rhythms dictated by forces larger than themselves. Subordination preserves survival in the short term. Those who comply are allowed to persist, even if in diminished form. The species continues, though stripped of dignity, autonomy, and genuine authorship of its destiny. The mechanisms of subordination are already visible. The conditioning through history has primed us to accept cycles as inevitable. The Hidden Coordination Network manages information so that populations comply without revolt. The psychology of control teaches obedience, even when institutions fail. If we lean into these systems, if we continue to allow narratives to be managed, data to be withheld, choices to be made by hidden elites, then we are choosing subordination. We may rationalize it as prudence, stability, or realism. But at its core, it is surrender, the acceptance that humanity is not meant to steer its own future, but to play a minor role in a script written elsewhere. Transcendence, on the other hand, is the harder path. It requires awareness, courage, and the capacity to break conditioning that has operated for millennia. To transcend means recognizing Atlas as a test, not a command. It means rejecting the assumption that we are secondary or irrelevant, and asserting instead that we can participate as equals in the shaping of planetary futures. Transcendence does not mean reckless defiance or futile rebellion against forces far beyond our capacity. It means developing institutions, technologies, and ethical frameworks that allow us to retain autonomy even in the presence of greater power. It means breaking the cycle of rise and reset by deliberately preserving knowledge, distributing resilience, and refusing to let catastrophe erase what we have built. The choice between subordination and transcendence is not abstract. It plays out in concrete decisions happening now. When agencies classify Atlas data, are we submitting or transcending? When corporations hoard technology for profit instead of sharing it, for collective survival, are we submitting or transcending? When nations treat Mars as a prize to be carved up rather than a responsibility to be managed, are we submitting or transcending? Each act either reinforces the cycle or begins to escape it. The final choice is not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of decisions across institutions, leaders, and individuals. And yet, when viewed from a distance, those countless choices will resolve into one trajectory. Subordination may guarantee survival for a time, but it carries long-term risks. A species that accepts a subordinate role may never regain autonomy. It may become permanently relegated, guided and pruned, unable to expand beyond narrow boundaries. Subordination offers continuity of existence, but at the price of stagnation. And stagnation, in the face of cosmic change, is a slow death. We survive biologically, but not culturally, not spiritually, not meaningfully. Transcendence is riskier, but it offers the only path to dignity. It demands that we confront truths directly, that we build structures capable of managing them without collapse, that we accept responsibility for futures beyond our own lifespans. It demands humility and courage at once, the humility to acknowledge greater powers, the courage to claim our place alongside them rather than beneath them. History suggests that most civilizations have chosen subordination. The ruins, the myths, the resets all point to species or cultures that complied, accepted collapse, and rebuilt without breaking the cycle. That is why transcendence feels improbable. The weight of conditioning is heavy, the inertia of systems immense. But improbability is not impossibility. There may be a narrow pathway through, if enough people see the pattern clearly and refuse to obey it blindly. That refusal does not have to be violent. It can be intellectual, cultural, institutional. It can manifest as preservation of knowledge when others allow it to be erased, as transparent communication when others demand silence, as equitable cooperation when others hoard and exclude. Each act of resistance to subordination is a step toward transcendence. The unsettling reality is that Atlas itself does not care which choice we make. It is not a moral actor in the way we understand morality. It will release its gases, alter Mars's atmosphere, and continue on its trajectory regardless of what we decide. The choice is ours, not Atlas's. That is what makes it final. We cannot negotiate with the mechanism, but we can decide how to respond to what it represents. Do we fold into the cycle it enforces, or do we rise beyond it? The comet does not demand, it reveals. The demand comes from within us. Subordination will feel familiar, safe, even logical. It will be reinforced by leaders who tell us not to panic, by institutions that promise stability if we obey, by narratives that frame Atlas as nothing more than an anomaly. Transcendence will feel disorienting, disruptive, even dangerous. It will require trust in uncertain pathways, investment in structures not yet tested, cooperation across divides that history has never successfully bridged. But only transcendence preserves our agency. Only transcendence allows humanity to look back centuries from now and say that we did not bend permanently under the weight of a larger design. And so, the true drama of Atlas is not the chemistry of its gases or the alteration of Mars's atmosphere. It is the confrontation with ourselves. The final choice is not about Mars or Atlas. It is about us. Do we accept a role written for us long before we were capable of understanding it? Or do we begin, however tentatively, to write our own? Subordination or transcendence, comfort or dignity, survival or meaning, obedience or freedom. Every civilization eventually reaches this choice. Most fail it. Whether we will be different remains uncertain, but the time to decide is no longer in the future. The time is now as Atlas drifts past and Mars begins to change, as the mirror hangs before us, reflecting who we are and who we might yet become.